The gaslight flickered against the wet cobbles of Whitechapel. A November wind carried the smell of horse manure and coal smoke through the narrow lanes. Somewhere on Commercial Street, a costermonger closed his stall for the night, his hands numb through fingerless gloves. Inside a small room above a public house, a clerk at Scotland Yard bent over a ledger by candlelight. His pen scratched softly across the page. He wrote a name in careful copperplate. Michael Ostrog. Russian. A doctor, perhaps a thief. A man known to the asylums at Surrey and Banstead. The clerk paused. Outside, a hansom cab passed with a slow clatter of hooves. Rain began to fall against the window. The clerk dipped his pen again. He did not yet know that this name would slip quietly into the shadows of history. The clerk's ledger. Good evening, and welcome. Welcome to the bedside historian. The night has grown quiet now, and the world has folded itself away for a while. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whether the rain is on your window, or the wind is soft in the trees, or the house has finally gone still, let the day fall from your shoulders. Tell the darkness where you are. Tell it what hour it is on your side of the night. Let that small thought settle you into your pillow. If this voice is a comfort, and if these old stories help you drift, please subscribe to the channel and give the video a little press of thanks. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel grow, and it lets me keep lighting these candles for you, one story at a time. And now, gently, let us slip backward. Let us leave the noise of your century behind. Let us step into a small stone office in London in the year 1894, where a man in a high collar is writing 3 names on a piece of paper by lamplight, and one of those names is Michael Ostrog. The building stood on the Thames Embankment. It was built of red brick and pale stone, and its windows looked out over the grey river. The yard had only been there for 4 years. It still smelled of new paint and river damp. On this February morning, a mist lay low on the water. The pale sun could not burn it away. The lamps in the corridors had not been lowered. The gas hissed softly in the sconces. The clerks passed each other on the stairs with quiet nods. They wore black frock coats and stiff white collars. Their boots made a slow tap on the tiled floors. A young constable carried a tray of tea to an upper room. The cups rattled softly as he climbed. In one of the rooms on the upper floor, a man sat at a heavy desk of dark oak. His name was Melville Leslie Macnaghten. He was the chief constable of the Criminal Investigation Department. He had come to Scotland Yard only 3 years before. He had been a tea planter in Bengal. He had come home with a straight back and a slow, careful manner. His hair was neatly parted. His moustache was trimmed close. He wore a grey waistcoat with a small gold chain across it. On his desk stood a green shaded lamp. The lamp cast a small pool of light on the leather blotter. Beside the lamp sat a silver inkwell and a wooden pen tray. Macnaghten opened a fresh folio. The paper was thick and cream-coloured. He smoothed it flat with the side of his hand. He dipped his pen into the ink. He paused. The nib hung above the page. Outside the window, a barge sounded its horn on the river. A gull cried once and was gone. He began to write. He was writing a private memorandum. It was not meant for the newspapers. It was not meant for the public at all. It was meant for the files and for a small circle of senior men within the yard. The memorandum was a reply to a story that had been printed in a London paper. That paper had claimed that a man named Thomas Cutbush was the murderer of Whitechapel. Macnaghten did not believe it. He wanted to set his own private view on record. He wanted the yard to have a paper in its drawer if the question ever rose again. His pen moved slowly. He wrote of Cutbush first. He set down what was known of the man. Then he turned the page. He wrote that, in his own opinion, 3 other men were far more likely than Cutbush to have been the killer. He wrote the first name, Montague John Druitt, a barrister, a schoolmaster, a body pulled from the Thames. Then he wrote the second name, Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew, a resident of Whitechapel, a man committed to an asylum. Then he paused again. He looked out at the mist on the river. He dipped the pen once more. He wrote the third name in careful copperplate. Michael Ostrog. A Russian doctor. A thief. A man of many false names. A man known to the asylums. The clerk in the outer room heard the pen stop. He heard the small tap of the nib against the rim of the inkwell. He did not look up. He was copying a warrant into a large ledger. He was a young man with pale hands. He wore black cotton oversleeves to protect his cuffs. He had come to the yard from a merchant's counting house in Cheapside. He earned 32 shillings a week. He lived with his mother in a small terrace in Camberwell. He walked to work each morning across Westminster Bridge. On his way, he bought a hot pie from a stall near the Embankment. The pie cost him 1 penny. He ate it as he walked. He wiped his fingers on a scrap of newspaper. It was, he thought, a good enough life. Inside the office, Macnaghten laid down his pen. He turned the paper to read what he had written. He read it slowly. He read it twice. He did not add a great deal about Ostrog. He wrote that the man was a mad Russian doctor and a convict. He wrote that Ostrog had been detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. He wrote that the man's whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. Those were his exact words. He set the paper aside to dry. He pressed a blotter gently against the ink. He closed the folio. He tied it with a length of red silk ribbon. He rose from his chair. He crossed to the window. He looked down at the river. A string of coal barges was moving up on the tide. Their smoke drifted low across the water. A woman was walking on the far bank with a basket on her arm. A child ran ahead of her, pointing at the gulls. Macnaghten watched them for a moment. Then he turned back to the desk. He rang a small brass bell. The clerk came in at once. He had a soft voice. He kept his hands behind his back. Macnaghten handed him the folio. He asked that it be placed in the private files of the chief constable. He asked that it not be copied. He asked that it not be shown outside the yard. The clerk bowed his head. He carried the folio out with both hands, as if it were a small and delicate animal. In the corridor, another clerk passed him with a stack of registers. They nodded to each other. Neither spoke. The young clerk carried the folio to a room at the end of the passage. The room was long and narrow. Its walls were lined with tall cabinets of dark wood. Each cabinet had shallow drawers with small brass handles. On each handle was a paper tag written in a fine hand. The clerk found the drawer for the chief constable's private papers. He unlocked it with a small key. He slid the folio inside. He closed the drawer. He locked it again. He wrote the date in a small ledger. 23rd of February, 1894. He set the pen down. He left the room. He locked the door behind him. That was all. The folio lay in the dark of the drawer. The gaslight in the corridor hissed on. Somewhere in the building, a telephone bell rang. A voice answered. Down in the yard behind the building, a horse stamped once and was still, and a name that had been written in careful copperplate began, from that moment, its quiet life inside the machinery of the yard. Michael Ostrog. It was not a common name in London. It sounded foreign on an English tongue. It carried the memory of long, cold rivers, of onion domes, of birch forests standing under snow. The clerks who came upon it in later years would frown. They would try to place it. Some of them would misread the letters and copy it as Astrogoff or as Otero or as Snell. That was how it went in the Victorian office. A single hand wrote a name once, and 100 later hands copied it, and each copy carried its own small errors, and slowly the truth of a life was worn down at the edges like a coin passed too often from palm to palm. But on that February morning the name was fresh. It was written by a man who believed he knew what he was doing. Macnaghten had been at the yard for 3 years. He had read the old files. He had spoken with the men who had walked the streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. He had listened to their guesses, to their certainties, to their weariness. The Ripper case, as it had come to be called, was a wound in the yard. It had not healed. It would not heal. Every year the newspapers picked at it. Every year some new theory rose and fell. Macnaghten wanted to set his own record straight. He was a careful man. He wrote his memorandum for a small audience of his peers, and he expected it to remain among them. He could not have known that his paper would one day leave that drawer. He could not have known that a copy would surface in the hands of a journalist half a century later. He could not have known that Ostrog's name, written so softly on that quiet morning, would be printed in books and argued over in lecture halls for generations. He simply closed the folio, tied the red ribbon, and went to lunch at his club. His club was on Pall Mall. He walked there through the streets of Whitehall. A soft rain had begun to fall. He turned up the collar of his overcoat. He passed a knot of newspaper boys at the corner. Their voices rose and fell in the damp air. One of them held up a paper for a passing gentleman. The headline spoke of trouble in South Africa. Another headline spoke of a debate in the Commons on the Irish question. There was no mention of Whitechapel that morning. There had been no mention for many months. The horror of 1888 was, for the reading public, growing old. But in the drawer he had just locked, a name lay quietly waiting. Michael Ostrog. A man born perhaps in Russia, perhaps in Poland, perhaps in a small town on the eastern edge of one empire or the other. A man who had walked into Oxford and Cambridge in stolen gowns. A man who had stood in dock after dock in provincial courts, giving each time a different name, a different profession, a different country of birth. A man who had been flogged in Chatham and starved in Aylesbury. A man who had been declared insane and shut behind the walls of Surrey County Asylum. A man who had, in Macnaghten's careful copperplate, become one of the 3 most probable suspects for the worst crimes of the Victorian age. The clerk in the outer room finished his warrant. He blew softly on the ink. He closed the ledger. He put on his black bowler hat. He took his umbrella from the stand. It was near 5 in the afternoon. He stepped out into the corridor. He passed the drawer where the folio now lay. He did not know it was there. He did not know its contents. He walked down the stone stairs and out into the fine rain of the embankment. He crossed Westminster Bridge with the great River Black beneath him. On the far side, a man was selling roasted chestnuts from a small brazier. The clerk bought a paper twist for a halfpenny. The chestnuts were hot in his hand. He walked on toward home. Behind him, Scotland Yard stood dark against the mist. Its windows glowed a dim yellow. Its chimneys sent up soft plumes of smoke into the London evening. A single gaslight burned in the corridor outside the room of drawers. The mist gathered at the base of the building. The river moved on under the bridge. Somewhere across the city, in a lodging house near Borough High Street, an old man in a worn coat sat by a small coal fire. He was thin. His hair was grey and unkempt. His hands trembled a little as he warmed them. He answered, on that evening, to the name of Bertrand Ashley. He had answered in other years to Grant, to Sobieski, to Count Sobieski, to Dr. Grant, to Ashley, to a dozen other names besides. His true name, if such a thing could be said to belong to him, was Michael Ostrog. He did not know that his name had, that day, been written into a memorandum at Scotland Yard. He did not know that 3 of England's senior policemen would soon read it. He did not know that his shadow had begun, quietly, to lengthen across the century to come. He only knew that the fire was low, that his bones ached, that the winter was long, and that somewhere in the dark house above him a child was crying, and a woman was singing a soft, tired lullaby to send it back to sleep. The lamp on Macnaghten's empty desk was turned out. The office fell into shadow. The mist thickened on the river, and in the locked drawer, tied with its length of red silk ribbon, the folio waited, patient as stone, for the slow hand of history to reach for it. A Russian shadow. The truth of Michael Ostrog began, if it began anywhere at all, in the eastern reaches of Europe, in a country that shifted its borders like a restless sleeper. Some records place his birth in the year 1833. Some place it a year or 2 later. He would give a different year to nearly every judge who asked him. He would give a different town, a different father, a different trade. In one court he was born in Warsaw. In another he was born in Kiev. In another he was born in Riga. In a small English police station, when pressed, He once said he was born in the Russian steppe under a cart, and the constable, who had heard many strange things, did not write that answer down. What is certain is that he grew up in a world of hard winters and soft candlelight. The houses in the towns of the Russian West were built low against the wind. Their walls were thick. Their windows were small. In winter the shutters were closed at 4 in the afternoon, and the frost would climb the panes in feathered patterns by supper. Families slept on stoves of clay tile that held the heat until dawn. The streets outside were rutted with cart tracks and packed with grey snow. A man walking to market wore felt boots stuffed with straw. A woman going to church wore a long shawl over her hair and carried a lantern in the black mornings of Advent. The boy who would one day call himself Michael Ostrog would have known these things. He would have known the smell of black bread baking in a stone oven. He would have known the sound of a priest chanting in a small wooden church, and the taste of salted cucumbers pulled from a wooden barrel, and the sting of a birch switch when he stole from his father's pocket. If his father was a priest, as he sometimes claimed, then he grew among candles and censers and long dark robes that swept the floor. If his father was a soldier, as he sometimes claimed instead, then he grew among the smell of gun oil and the sight of dented tin cups on a rough wooden shelf. If his father was a merchant, as he claimed at other times, then he grew among sacks of grain and bolts of coarse cloth, and the click of an abacus on a counter of scarred pine. The only steady thing about his childhood, as it came down through the paperwork of many nations, was that he learned languages. He spoke Russian. He spoke Polish. He spoke a little Yiddish, picked up from the boys in the market square. He learned German from a tutor in his youth, and he took to it quickly. He learned French later, in the classrooms of a small provincial school, where he sat on a hard bench and copied verbs into a battered notebook by the light of a tallow candle. He learned English later still, in the cabins of merchant ships and on the docks of northern ports. In each of these languages he could bow and beg and lie and pray. In each of them he would one day sign a false name to a false letter and press a stolen ring into hot wax. By the age of 20 he had drifted west. He appears, faintly, in the records of the free city of Frankfurt, where a young man giving the name of Max Grief was arrested for the theft of a silver cup from an inn. He was released after a few days, for the innkeeper could not swear it was the same man. He appears again in the police books of Cologne, where a young man giving the name of Alexander Sobieski was questioned about a forged letter of introduction. He was fined and set free. He appears in a small file in Munich, where a man of similar description sold a book of engravings that did not belong to him. He appears in Vienna, where the police were kinder and the courts slower. He crossed borders on foot and by rail. The great railways of the 1850s were spreading across Europe like veins across the back of a hand. A young man with a small satchel could buy a third-class ticket for a few kreuzer and sit on a wooden bench through a long, cold night, wrapped in his coat, sharing a corner with a family of Bohemian glassworkers going west to find work. He could eat a sausage bought at a station buffet. He could sleep against the shuddering wall of the carriage while the smoke of the engine blew back past the window. In the morning, he could step down onto a strange platform, straighten his collar, and become a different man. By the year 1863, he had reached Paris. The city then was under the reign of the third Napoleon. The great boulevards were being cut through the old quarters by the prefect houseman. Whole streets of medieval houses were being torn down. New apartment blocks of pale stone were rising in their place, 5 and 6 stories high, with wrought-iron balconies and mansard roofs of dark slate. Gas lamps stood on every corner. Cafes spilled their small round tables onto the pavements. Ladies in wide crinolines walked slowly past the milliners' windows. Men in top hats read the newspapers at the marble counters of the corner tabacs. Into this city came a thin foreign man with a soft voice and clever hands. He gave his name, at various times, as Bertrand Ashley, as Count Sobieski of Poland, as Dr. Grant of Petersburg. He wore a black frock coat cut a little too large for his frame. He carried a small leather case. In the case he kept a set of visiting cards printed in 3 different names, a small silver seal, a stub of red sealing wax, and a folded letter of introduction to a nobleman who did not exist. He took lodgings in a small hotel near the Gare du Nord, on a street where the smell of coal smoke from the trains mixed with the smell of onion soup from the cheap eating houses across the way. He paid for his room in advance, in coins, so that no questions would be asked. In Paris, he learned the trades that would follow him for the rest of his life. He learned to walk into a bookshop and speak learnedly of rare editions, until the shopkeeper trusted him enough to leave him alone with the shelves. He learned to slip a small volume under his coat and walk out into the street without hurrying. He learned to visit the great houses of the wealthy under a false name, present a false letter, admire the plate on the sideboard, and return, another day, when the family was at church, to relieve them of a silver salver. He learned to write letters of introduction in 3 different hands, so that they would not appear to come from the same pen. He was, in his own strange way, a scholar of the small crime. He did not hurt people. He did not, in these early years, carry a knife. He watched. He listened. He measured. He made small, careful calculations. He liked churches best, for churches were open all day, and no one questioned a well-dressed man who knelt for a few minutes at the back and then rose and drifted toward the vestry. In the vestry there were often silver candlesticks. There were sometimes small silver dishes for the offering. He would slip them into the deep pockets sewn inside his coat and walk out with his head bowed, as though in prayer. But Paris grew unfriendly. The police there were quick and thorough. The dossiers of the prefecture were kept in tall cabinets in the Rue de Jerusalem. A man arrested once was remembered. A man arrested twice was watched. In the summer of 1866, a man giving the name of Ashley was arrested for the theft of a set of silver spoons from a hotel dining room on the Boulevard des Italiens. He was tried in a small court. He was sentenced to a term in a French prison. He served part of it. He was released, whether by pardon or by escape the records do not say, and he crossed the Channel to England. He came into Dover on a passenger steamer on a grey morning in the late spring. The white cliffs rose above him. A cold wind blew off the water. The gulls cried. He carried a small carpet bag. He wore a black hat set square on his head. He answered the questions of the port authorities in careful English. He gave his name as Bertrand Ashley, gentleman of Warsaw. He said he had come to England for the benefit of his health. He was allowed to pass. He walked down the gangway onto the stone quay. He set foot on English soil for the first time. It was, so far as anyone can now tell, a Tuesday. England in those years was in the middle years of the reign of Queen Victoria. The country was rich and hard. The great mills of Manchester roared day and night. The mines of the north sent up black smoke that darkened the sky. The trains carried coal and iron and cloth from the ports to the cities and back again. In London, the streets were thick with horses. A gentleman crossing the Strand had to watch his boots for the droppings. The gas lamps were being lit each evening by boys with long poles. The Thames was foul with the waste of 1 million people. In the summer of 1858, only a few years before, the smell of the river had been so bad that the members of Parliament had hung sheets soaked in lime across the windows of the chamber and had still fled the room. Into this England came the man from the East. He travelled first to the coastal towns. He was seen in Brighton, where he took rooms in a boarding house on the front and paid with a bad cheque. He was seen in Portsmouth, where he presented himself as a naval surgeon of the Russian service and dined for a week at the officers' mess before slipping away in the night. He was seen in Bristol, where he preached one Sunday from the pulpit of a small chapel, giving his name as the Reverend Dr. Grant, and took up a collection which he took with him when he left. In each place he stayed only long enough to reap the small harvest of trust that his manners could grow, and then he moved on. The English police were slower than the French, but they were patient. They kept books. They kept ledgers. They passed word by telegraph. By the year 1866, a description of the man was already circulating among the constabularies of the southern counties. He was said to be about 5 feet 11 inches in height. He was said to have dark hair and dark eyes. He was said to speak English with a Russian accent, and French with a Polish accent, and German with a Russian accent, and to be capable of assuming any of these accents at will. He was said to have a scar on his right thumb. He was said to have a slight stoop. He was said to walk with a soft, careful tread, as though the ground beneath his feet might not be trusted to hold him. He crossed and recrossed the country by rail. He rode third class, on hard wooden benches, wedged between soldiers on leave and farm women taking eggs to market. He ate cold pork pies bought at station buffets for a penny each. He drank weak tea from thick white cups. He slept sitting upright, his hat pulled down over his eyes. When the train reached its terminus, he would step down into a strange town, take a room at a cheap inn, and begin, once more, the careful theatre of his life. He would visit the local bookseller. He would visit the local silversmith. He would visit the local vicar. He would present his card. He would smile his slow, tired smile. He would speak of Petersburg, of Warsaw, of Vienna, of Paris, of the great libraries and the great collections of the great houses of Europe. He would draw the trust of good men toward himself as a lodestone draws iron filings. And then, in the small hours of some grey morning, he would slip out of his room with a candlestick or a book or a snuff-box hidden inside his coat, and he would walk to the station, and he would ride away. His true name, if he had ever owned one, he kept locked inside himself. When the English courts finally began to catch him, and to catch him often, they wrote in their books whatever name he chose to give them on that day. In the assizes at Aylesbury he was Bertrand Ashley. In the sessions at Reading he was Claude Caton. In the police court at Chatham he was Count Sobieski. In the little town of Woolwich he was Dr. Grant. In the docks at Guildford he was Michael Ostrog, and it was under this name, at last, that the machinery of English justice would come to know him, and to write him down, and to hold him fast. But that was still some years away. In the late summer of 1866 he was a shadow, drifting between the coastal towns of southern England, a thin man in a black coat with a small carpet bag and a large collection of names. The evenings were growing shorter. The blackberries were ripening in the hedges along the country lanes. In the villages the church bells rang for evensong. In the ports the ships lay at anchor with their lamps lit, rocking softly on the tide. And in a small parlour in a boarding house in Portsmouth, a landlady was sitting at her kitchen table by the light of a single candle, counting out the coins her new lodger had paid her that morning, and wondering, with a small quiet frown, why the shilling on the top of the little pile had a strange soft feel to it, as though it had been made not of good English silver, but of something else, something baser, something that would not stand the bite of a true tooth. She set the coin aside. She rose and went to the window. The sea was dark beyond the roofs of the town. A single ship's lantern moved slowly on the horizon. She drew the curtain. She turned back to the table. She blew out the candle. Above her, in a small room under the eaves, the lodger who had given his name as Bertrand Ashley was already gone, his window open to the night, his bed neatly made, his carpet bag missing from the corner where it had stood only an hour before. The stairs did not creak. The front door did not slam. He had learned, long ago, the trick of leaving a house without sound. He was already walking, in the dark, toward the railway station, and the last train to London, and the long, strange road that would carry him, in time, into a locked drawer at Scotland Yard, and into the memorandum of a careful man writing 3 names in careful copperplate by the light of a green-shaded lamp. The false physician. He came into London on a Tuesday evening in the late summer of 1866. The train pulled into Waterloo Station under a great arched roof of iron and smoked glass. Steam rose from the engine in soft grey clouds. The whistles of the departing trains cut through the noise of the crowd. Porters in blue coats pushed barrows of luggage across the platform. A newsboy shouted the evening headlines by the ticket barrier. A woman in a black bonnet stood weeping quietly beside a stack of trunks, waiting for a husband who did not come. Into this crowd stepped the thin man in the black coat. He carried his small carpet bag in his left hand. He wore his hat set square on his head. He walked with a soft, careful tread across the platform, and out through the barrier, and into the London night. He took a room that first night in a lodging-house near the river, on a narrow street off the Waterloo Road. The house was tall and thin. Its plaster was cracked. Its windows were smeared with the black soot of the trains. The landlady was a widow of 50 with a heavy Irish accent and a sharp, small eye. She looked him over on the doorstep. She named her price. 2 shillings a night, breakfast included, no gentleman callers after 10. He counted the coins into her hand. She led him up 3 flights of creaking stairs to a small room at the back. The room had a narrow iron bed, a washstand with a chipped white basin, and a single high window that looked out over the slate roofs. He set his bag down on the floor. He locked the door behind him. He sat on the edge of the bed. He was, that night, a man of no country, no name, and no history that he cared to remember. In the morning he rose early. He washed his face in cold water from the basin. He shaved with a small folding razor. He put on a clean shirt from the carpet bag and tied a black silk cravat at his throat. He brushed his coat with a small clothes brush. He set his hat straight. He went downstairs to the kitchen, where the landlady gave him a bowl of thin porridge and a mug of black tea. He ate without hurrying. He paid for a second night in advance. Then he stepped out into the streets of London, and he began the work that would occupy him for the next 7 years. He did not stay in London for long that first visit. London was too large, too watched, too full of foreign faces already known to the police. He wanted the small country towns. He wanted the quiet cathedral cities. He wanted the ancient universities. He wanted the places where a foreign gentleman in a good coat, speaking careful English with a soft Russian accent, would be welcomed as a curiosity rather than watched as a threat. And so he bought a third-class ticket at Paddington Station, and he rode west, and he came, in the middle of an autumn afternoon, into the city of Oxford. Oxford in the year 1866 was a place of grey stone and green lawns and slow bells. The colleges stood behind their high walls like a row of small kingdoms. Their gates were of thick oak studded with iron. Their porters wore black bowler hats and stiff white collars. Their inner quadrangles were quiet with the sound of footsteps on flagstones and the low murmur of voices reading Greek. The undergraduates walked to their lectures in black gowns that flapped behind them like the wings of tired birds. The dons dined at high tables under portraits of dead benefactors. The chapels sang the old evensong at 6:30, and the sound of the choirs drifted out over the meadows. Into this city came the thin foreign man. He gave his name at the small hotel on the Corn Market as Dr. Max Grief of the University of Vienna. He said he was a scholar of the natural sciences. He said he had come to Oxford to consult certain rare volumes in the library of one of the colleges. He carried, in the inner pocket of his coat, a letter of introduction to the Master of Balliol. The letter was written in a fine copperplate hand on paper of good weight. It bore the seal of a professor of Heidelberg, pressed into red wax. The letter was, of course, entirely false. He had written it himself in a small room in Paris, on paper he had bought from a stationer in the Rue de Rivoli, and he had pressed the seal with a stamp he had cut from a piece of soft lead. The hotel keeper did not question him. He gave him a good room on the first floor overlooking the street. He sent up a supper of cold beef and pickled walnuts, and a small jug of ale. The foreign gentleman ate at a small table by the window. He watched the students passing below in the lamplight. He heard the bell of Tom Tower strike 9, and then 10, and then 11. He drew the curtain. He slept the deep, still sleep of a man who has laid his snare, and now has only to wait. In the morning he presented himself at the porter's lodge of Balliol College. The porter took the letter in his gloved hand. He read it slowly. He looked up at the foreign gentleman. He asked him to wait in the small stone room off the lodge. The gentleman sat on a hard wooden bench. He folded his hands in his lap. He watched a fly crawl slowly across the whitewashed wall. After perhaps 20 minutes the porter returned. The master was engaged, he said, but a fellow of the college would receive the gentleman in his rooms in the second quadrangle. The fellow was a man of 40, with a soft round face and thick spectacles. He wore a black gown over a suit of grey worsted. His rooms were lined with books to the ceiling. A small coal fire burned in the grate. He rose from his desk and offered his visitor a chair. He read the letter again. He asked, in careful German, whether the gentleman had brought greetings from the professor at Heidelberg. The foreign gentleman answered in careful German. He said that the professor sent his warmest regards, and that he had asked particularly that his English colleague be shown the great 15th-century herbal that was said to be kept in the college library. The fellow smiled. He said it would be his pleasure. He rang a small brass bell. A servant came. He gave orders that the visitor should be shown to the library at once, and that every courtesy should be extended to him. The library of Balliol was a long room with high windows and dark wooden shelves. The shelves rose to the ceiling in tiers, reached by narrow ladders of oak. The books were bound in calfskin and vellum. Some had clasps of tarnished brass. Some had covers so worn that their titles could no longer be read. A single librarian sat at a desk near the door, reading a book by the light of a small oil lamp. He looked up as the foreign gentleman entered. He nodded. He returned to his reading. The foreign gentleman moved slowly along the shelves. His fingertips brushed the spines. He drew down a volume here and a volume there. He carried them to a long oak table and laid them out. He opened one. He turned the pages carefully. He made small notes in a small leather notebook. To any watcher he was a scholar at his work. He was, in truth, taking the measure of the room. He was noting the position of the librarian's desk. He was noting the door to the outer passage. He was noting the shelf where the smallest and most valuable volumes were kept, high up, where a man on a ladder could not be easily seen from the door. He was noting, above all, the hour when the librarian rose from his desk and left the room for his afternoon tea. He returned to the library each day for a week. He grew known to the librarian. He was greeted with a small nod each morning. He brought a little parcel of sweet biscuits on the third day, and he shared them at the door of the reading room, and the librarian thought him a fine man, a gentleman, a true scholar. On the seventh day, when the librarian had risen at his usual hour and left the room, the foreign gentleman climbed the small oak ladder, and he took down a slim volume of Hours from the year 1480, and he slipped it inside his coat, and he came down the ladder without a sound, and he walked out through the door, and across the quadrangle, and out through the porter's lodge, and into the street, and he was gone from Oxford, before the bell of Tom Tower struck 5 that afternoon. He did the same at Cambridge in the winter of that year. He gave a different name and a different letter. He was received at one of the smaller colleges. He was shown into a chapel where the plate was laid out for the following morning's service. He admired the great silver chalice. He admired the small silver paten. He returned that night by a low door that had been left unlocked by a sleepy verger, and he carried both away in the deep pockets of his coat, and he took the first train south at dawn. He did the same at Eton in the spring. He walked up the long avenue of chestnut trees. He presented himself at the porter's lodge as a Polish nobleman of the house of Sobieski, come to see the school where his young cousin was said to be a boarder. There was, of course, no cousin. But the porter, who was a kindly man with a sick wife at home, did not question him. He was shown into the school library. He admired the collection of medieval manuscripts. He was left, for a small moment, alone. When he left the library, a small illuminated book of psalms was gone from its case, and the foreign nobleman was gone from the town, and by nightfall he was back in London, sitting in a small chop-house near Covent Garden, eating a plate of boiled mutton and drinking a pint of small beer, with a stolen book of psalms hidden beneath his chair in a canvas bag. He did not sell the books at once. He was careful about that. He knew that a rare volume, offered too soon in the wrong shop, would bring the police to the door within a week. He kept the books hidden. He rented a small room above a public house in Southwark, on a street that smelled of the tanneries and the river, and he stored his stolen goods in a locked wooden chest under the bed. When he needed money, he would take out one small item and carry it, wrapped in a piece of black cloth, to a dealer in the Strand, or to a Jewish silversmith in Whitechapel, or to a shop in the small streets behind Holborn, where questions were not asked. He would take what was offered. He would pocket the coins. He would walk out into the street with his head bowed, and he would spend the money slowly, on cheap rooms and cheap meals and long third-class railway tickets to the next town, and the next, and the next. He called himself, in these years, by many names. He was Dr. Grant when he was preaching in country chapels. He was Count Sobieski when he was dining in officers' messes. He was Bertrand Ashley when he was signing the register of a hotel. He was Max Grief when he was reading in a college library. He was Claude Caton when he was writing a bad cheque to a country tailor. He was at times a surgeon of the Russian army, at times a doctor of divinity of the Sorbonne, at times a scholar of natural philosophy of the University of Padua. He carried, in the inner pocket of his coat, a small folded paper for each of these lives. Each paper was written in a different hand. Each bore a different seal. Each was a small, careful lie, cut from the greater lie of his life, like a slice cut from a loaf. He was, in the plain speaking of the courts that would soon receive him, a false physician. He had never studied medicine. He had never sat an examination. He had never been apprenticed to a country doctor or served in a hospital ward. He knew a few Latin names for herbs. He knew the names of certain diseases. He could speak, when pressed, of the humours of the body, of the balance of the blood, of the influence of the moon upon the sick. He had picked up these small scraps in reading rooms and in overheard conversations. He wore them like a stolen coat. It was enough, in those years, to fool a country vicar, or a widowed landlady, or a young man dying of a fever in a lodging-house on the outskirts of a market town. He fooled, for a while, a great many people. But England was a small country, and its rails were fast, and its telegraphs faster still. By the year 1873, the police of half a dozen counties knew his description. They knew his manner. They knew the little tricks of his trade. The wire hummed between Reading and Aylesbury. The wire hummed between Guildford and Woolwich. The wire hummed between Chatham and the Yard in London. The name that came most often on the wire, now, was the name he had first given at the docks in Guildford, Michael Ostrog. And so, on a raw January morning in the year 1873, in a small town on the Berkshire Downs where he had been passing himself as a Dr. Grant of the Russian Imperial Service, two constables in blue serge coats climbed the stairs of a boarding-house on the market square, and they knocked upon the door of a small back room, and they called upon the foreign gentleman inside to open in the name of the Queen. There was a long silence. There was the sound of a chair being scraped softly across a wooden floor. There was the sound of a window being lifted. And then there was the sound of the door being opened at last. And the thin man in the black coat stood in the doorway with his hat already on his head, and his carpet-bag in his hand, and he bowed to the constables, and he said, in his soft Russian accent, that he was entirely at their service. They took him down the stairs. They took him across the market square. They took him to the small police station beside the church. They set him on a hard wooden bench. They asked him his name. He gave it, that morning, as Michael Ostrog. He gave his age as 40. He gave his birthplace as the city of St. Petersburg. He gave his profession as physician. They wrote it all down in a large ledger, in a careful copperplate hand. They did not know, and he did not tell them, that the man they had written down would in time pass through the gates of Aylesbury and Chatham and the county asylum of Surrey, and that his name would one day be carried by a soft grey wire to a room in Scotland Yard and set down again, by another careful pen, in another careful ledger, beside two other names, in a memorandum tied with red silk ribbon and locked away in the drawer of a green-shaded desk. The Prisons of Her Majesty. The magistrates of Berkshire committed him for trial at the next assizes. The assizes were held in the county town some weeks later, in a courtroom of dark panelled wood beneath a high plastered ceiling. The judge sat upon a raised bench under a carved royal arms. He wore a scarlet robe and a full-bottomed wig of grey horsehair that fell across his shoulders. A small posy of dried lavender lay on the desk before him, a custom left from the plague years, to keep the smell of the prisoners from rising into the noses of the bench. The clerk of the court read the charges in a slow, level voice. Theft, false pretences, the passing of forged notes, the presentation of a false letter of introduction, the unlawful use of a false name. The prisoner was asked how he pleaded. The prisoner, standing between two gaolers in the dock, bowed his head slightly and said, in his soft accented English, that he was not guilty. The trial took 2 days. Witnesses came from 3 counties. A country vicar spoke of a Dr. Grant who had preached in his chapel and taken up the collection. A silversmith from Reading spoke of a Count Sobieski who had bought a snuff-box on credit and never returned. A landlady from Guildford spoke of the small back room where a Bertrand Ashley had left a locked chest that, when broken open, held 3 silver spoons, a chalice, and a book of hours bound in worn calfskin. The prisoner sat still through it all. He watched each witness with a patient, attentive eye. He did not interrupt. When the judge asked whether he wished to speak in his own defence, he rose slowly and said that he was a poor foreigner, that his English was uncertain, that he had been the victim of an unfortunate confusion of names. The jury did not believe him. They returned their verdict in less than an hour. Guilty upon all counts. The judge waited for the room to settle. He set aside his pen. He looked down at the man in the dock. He said, in a voice without heat, that the prisoner was clearly a man of some education, and that he had used his gifts for the corruption of trust. He sentenced him to 10 years of penal servitude. The clerk wrote the sentence in the great ledger. The gaolers laid their hands upon the prisoner's arms. They led him down the wooden stairs at the back of the dock. His boots rang once on the boards and then were gone. He was taken by a closed van to the county gaol. The van was black and windowless, drawn by 2 heavy horses, driven by a man in a caped coat. Inside, the prisoner sat on a narrow wooden bench in the dark, his wrists shackled together, his ankles chained to a ring set in the floor. He could hear the hooves on the cobbles. He could hear the cries of the street sellers as the van rolled past. He could smell the horses and the leather and the sour breath of the other prisoner, a farm boy of 19, who sat opposite him in the dark and wept quietly the whole way. At the gate of the gaol he was received by a warder in a dark blue uniform with brass buttons. His name was entered in the reception book. His height was taken. His weight was taken. His scars were noted, one by one, upon a printed form. A small scar upon the right thumb, a long scar upon the left forearm, a puckered white mark upon the left shoulder, a fresh cut upon the brow, from where a constable's staff had caught him in the taking. He was stripped of his fine black coat and his silk cravat and his good linen shirt. His clothes were folded and tied with string, and locked away in a small numbered box. He was given a suit of coarse brown wool, marked with broad arrows in black. He was given a cap of the same cloth. He was given a pair of heavy hobnailed boots that were a size too large. He was given a tin plate, a tin mug, a wooden spoon, and a small brown blanket. He was told his number. He was told that his name, from that moment, was of no interest to the state. He was, from that moment, only his number. He was led along a long corridor of iron and stone. Gas jets hissed in wire cages set high upon the walls. The floor was of scrubbed flagstone, and the sound of his boots echoed up into the vaulted roof. Iron doors stood in rows on either side. Each door had a small square opening at eye height, closed by a shutter. Behind each door was a cell of 8 feet by 6, whitewashed, with a small barred window set high, a plank bed hinged to the wall, a stool, a small table, and a bucket in the corner. He was pushed inside one such cell. The door was closed behind him. The bolt was shot. A soft click, and then silence. He sat down upon the plank bed. He held the tin plate in his hands. He looked at the whitewashed wall. He was, for the first time in many years, still. The first months at Aylesbury broke slower men entirely. The prisoners rose at 5:30 in the darkness. A great bell rang 3 times through the wing. Warders walked the corridors, striking each door with a wooden club, calling the men from sleep. The cells were unlocked one by one. The men stepped out in their brown suits, their tin mugs in their hands, and they filed in silence to the wash troughs. The silent system was still the rule then. No prisoner was to speak to another. No prisoner was to look upon another. A man caught whispering in the yard was given a day upon bread and water. A man caught passing a note was given 3 days in the dark cell, a stone chamber below the ground with no light and no bed, only a stone shelf and a bucket. Breakfast was a bowl of stirabout, a thin gruel of oatmeal and water, and 8 ounces of coarse brown bread. It was eaten in the cell, alone, with the door closed. At 7:30 the bell rang again. The men filed out into the yard. Then began the labour. The treadwheel stood in a long shed at the back of the prison. It was a great wooden drum, 20 feet long, 6 feet across, with iron steps set into its outer face. 24 men could work it at once, standing side by side. Each man gripped a wooden handrail set into the wall above the drum. Each man stepped and stepped and stepped, his weight turning the wheel beneath him. If a man slipped, his shins were struck by the moving steps. If a man stopped, the warder at the end of the shed struck him with a leather strap. The wheel turned nothing. It ground no corn. It pumped no water. It existed only to break the strength of the man upon it. Each prisoner was required to climb the equivalent of 8,640 feet in a day. It was the height of Snowdon, climbed each morning, in a shed that smelled of sweat and pine and hot iron. He worked the wheel. He was thin, but he was tall, and his legs were strong from years of walking English roads. He kept his pace. He did not speak. He watched the man beside him, a young clerk from Bristol who had forged his master's signature, grow paler and paler through the first week. On the 8th day, the young clerk slipped upon the step. His shin was gashed open to the bone. He was taken to the infirmary. He did not return. There was other labour. There was the oakum shed, where the men sat upon low stools and pulled apart lengths of old tarred rope, teasing the fibres with their fingernails until the wood of the walls was black with pitch, and the fingers of the pickers were split and bleeding. There was the shot drill, where the men stood in rows in the yard and lifted heavy iron cannonballs from one small heap to another, and back again, hour after hour, until the arms trembled and the back could not straighten. There was the crank, a small iron handle set into a box in each cell, which had to be turned 10,000 times a day, against a resistance set by the warder. A man who did not complete his 10,000 turns was given no supper. He completed his turns. He picked his oakum. He climbed his wheel. He did not, in the first year, receive a single mark against his conduct. The warders thought him a quiet, obedient foreigner, a man who had learned his lesson. They did not know that behind his still face he was learning them. He was learning the hours of the watch. He was learning the small habits of the chaplain, of the surgeon, of the governor. He was learning which warder had a soft heart for a foreign accent, and which warder took a bribe of tobacco, and which warder could be flattered with a Latin phrase. He was, in the manner of his old profession, taking the measure of the room. After 18 months at Aylesbury he was transferred, as convicts on long sentences often were, to the Public Works Prison at Chatham. The van carried him through the flat country of Kent in a grey November drizzle. He arrived at the gates of Chatham on a Saturday evening. The gates were of thick iron, painted black, set in a wall of yellow brick 20 feet high. Beyond the walls stretched the great dockyards of the Royal Navy, and the marshes, and the grey estuary of the Medway, and the low black hulks that lay rotting at anchor from the last century. At Chatham, the prisoners worked upon the fortifications. They quarried stone from the pits at Finsbury. They loaded it onto small tramway carts. They pushed the carts along iron rails to the sites of the new forts, where they broke the stone with hammers and set it in mortar under the eye of a warder with a loaded carbine. They dug drains. They dredged the mud from the shore. They worked from 7 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, with a break of half an hour at noon for a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread eaten sitting upon the wet earth. In summer the sun blistered the backs of their necks. In winter the wind off the estuary cut through the coarse brown wool of their suits, as though the cloth were paper. He worked at Chatham for 4 years. In those 4 years he was flogged 3 times. The first was for the theft of a small pocket-knife from a warder. He received 20 strokes of the cat, laid across his bare back at the whipping post in the yard. The cat was a whip of 9 leather thongs, each thong knotted with 3 small knots. A prison surgeon stood beside the post to count the strokes and to stop the flogging if the prisoner fainted. He did not faint. He stood with his cheek pressed to the wood, and he counted the strokes with the surgeon, and when the 20th stroke had fallen, he was cut down and led to the infirmary, where his back was washed with cold salt water and bound in strips of linen. It was 3 weeks before he could lie upon it. When he could stand again, he was set back to the quarry. The second flogging was for striking a warder. The third was for feigning a fit and biting the surgeon who came to attend him. After the third flogging, the surgeon wrote in the medical book that the prisoner was of a peculiar and cunning disposition, that he complained without cause, that he refused his food, that he claimed to hear voices whispering in the walls of his cell. The surgeon wrote that he could not, however, in honesty say that the man was mad. He was, the surgeon wrote, a very great liar. That was all. He gave false confessions in those years. It became a small habit with him. When a new warder came onto the wing, he would ask to speak with the chaplain, and he would confess, in a low, grave voice, to some old and unsolved crime. He confessed to the theft of a silver dish from a country house he had never entered. He confessed to a fraud upon a bank in Vienna that had never been robbed. He confessed, once, to the murder of a man in a lodging house in Marseille. The chaplains wrote down each confession. The confessions were passed to the governor. The governor sent word to the police. The police, in every case, could find no such crime, or no such victim, or no such house. It was a strange small game he played, and no one could quite say why. Some of the warders thought he did it to break the silence of his days. Some thought he did it to test the machinery of the law, to see how far a false word could be carried before it was found out. Some thought, in later years, that he had been laying down false trails against a day when a true trail might be laid. By the end of his 4 years at Chatham, he was a different man. His hair had gone grey at the temples. His shoulders had begun to stoop. His hands trembled a little when he lifted his tin mug. The scars upon his back were thick as cords beneath his shirt. His teeth had loosened from the poor food. His eyes had grown deep-set. He walked with the careful, small tread of a man whose bones had learned the weight of chains. He was, when the great iron gates of Chatham opened at last upon a raw morning in the autumn of 1879, a wreck of the thin foreign gentleman who had stepped from the train at Waterloo 13 years before. He was given his old clothes back from the numbered box. The good black coat had grown small upon him. The silk cravat was moth-eaten. He put them on. He was given a paper of discharge and a shilling for his fare. He walked out through the little door in the great gate. He stood for a moment on the muddy road beyond the wall. A cart passed, laden with cabbages. A gull cried overhead. He turned his collar up against the wind. He began, slowly, to walk toward the town. He had no home to go to. He had no friends. He had no trade that the honest world would accept. He had only his small store of stolen names, and the hard-remembered skill of a life he could no longer easily perform. He walked into the town of Chatham with his shilling in his hand, and he took a bowl of soup at a coffee stall by the river, and he began, from that first bowl, the strange downward road that would carry him, within only a few short years, past the courts and the country gaols and the public works, and into a long, low building of yellow brick beyond the fields of Wandsworth, where the windows were barred, and the corridors smelled of carbolic, and the men in white aprons carried keys of dull iron upon their belts, and where a small brass plate beside a heavy oak door read, in careful lettering, Surrey County Lunatic Asylum. The Asylum Gate. He drifted, in the years after Chatham, like a leaf carried on slow water. He was seen in the market towns of Kent. He was seen in the lodging-houses of Suffolk. He was seen at the counter of a pawn-shop in Lambeth, offering a set of silver studs for a few shillings. The studs were not his. The pawnbroker took them without comment, for a low price, and asked no name. Ostrog spent the money on a night's bed and a plate of eels at a stall by the river. In the morning he was gone again, walking north along the wet cobbles, his coat drawn close about his thin shoulders. He tried, in the first year of his liberty, to return to his old trades. He walked into a bookseller in Holborn and presented himself as a scholar of Petersburg. The bookseller had received a printed circular from the Yard only the month before. The circular bore a small line drawing of a thin foreign man with a soft stoop and a scar upon the right thumb. The bookseller looked at the man across his counter. He excused himself. He stepped through the small door at the back of the shop and sent his boy running for a constable. Ostrog was gone before the boy had reached the corner. But the circular was in every shop now. The wire had done its work. The old road was closed to him. He fell, then, into the small crimes of a hungry man. He took a coat from a peg in a tavern in Kennington. He took a loaf of bread from a stall in Borough Market. He took a copper pot from the yard of a lodging house in Wapping. Each theft brought him a few coppers. Each theft brought him also to the notice of some new constable, in some new parish, who wrote his description in some new ledger, and passed the word along the wire. He was arrested at Woolwich in the summer of 1880. He was arrested at Guildford in the autumn. He served short terms, 3 months here, 6 months there, in the small gaols of the southern counties. Each time he came out thinner. Each time his hands trembled a little more when he lifted his tin mug. By the winter of 1886 he was a poor thing indeed. His good black coat was gone at the elbows. His boots had been patched with strips of leather cut from a broken belt. His hair had grown long and grey, and it lay upon his collar in soft, dirty locks. He slept in doss houses when he had fourpence, on the stone steps of churches when he had none. He begged in a low, soft voice at the doors of the cheaper eating houses. He was often turned away. He was sometimes given a crust. He ate it standing in the road, in the rain, without complaint. It was in this state that he came, one grey afternoon in November of that year, into the yard of a great house in the country town of Kingston. He carried a small satchel. He wore his last clean collar. He had shaved that morning with a borrowed razor. He walked up the gravel drive with the slow, careful tread that had once carried him into the libraries of Oxford. He rang the bell. He asked to see the master of the house upon a matter of learned business. He did not see the master of the house. He saw, instead, a footman, who looked him up and down and told him to go round to the kitchen door. He went round to the kitchen door. The cook gave him a piece of bread and a mug of small beer, and she told him to wait upon the step. While he waited, he watched the yard. He watched the coach house. He watched the door to the plate room, which stood a little ajar in the soft grey light. When the cook turned her back to draw water from the pump, he slipped from the step and crossed the yard on silent feet. He was in the plate room for less than a minute. He came out with a silver tankard hidden inside his coat. He walked out of the yard as slowly as he had walked in. He was taken that same evening at the railway station, the tankard still in his coat, by a constable who had been warned by telegram from the great house. He gave his name, this time, as Claude Caton. It was written in the station book. It was passed to the magistrate. It was passed to the assizes at Kingston, where a judge in a grey wig sentenced him to 5 more years of penal servitude, and added, in a dry, tired voice, that the prisoner appeared to him a man of very peculiar habit, and that a medical opinion upon his sanity would be welcome. The medical opinion came in the small stone infirmary of the county gaol at Kingston. 2 doctors sat at a bare table. Ostrog was brought in between 2 warders. He was set upon a hard chair. The doctors asked him his name. He said he was Dr. Grant of Petersburg. They asked him his age. He said he was 300 years old. They asked him his profession. He said he was a physician to the court of the late Empress Catherine. He said that his enemies had followed him from Russia, that they whispered against him in every wall, that they had put poison in his broth at the gaol, that they had cut the leather of his boots by night while he slept. He said this in a low, calm voice, without heat, without haste, as though he were reciting a piece of learned Latin. The doctors wrote in their books. They asked him to hold out his hand. His hand trembled. They asked him to walk from one wall to the other. He walked with a small stoop. They asked him to name the Queen. He named the Empress Catherine again. They looked at one another. They wrote in their books. They rose, and they were gone. 2 days later, a paper was signed. The paper was countersigned by a magistrate. The paper was carried by a warder to the door of Ostrog's cell. He was told to put on his coat. He was told to gather his tin plate and his tin mug and his small brown blanket. He was told that he was no longer a prisoner of the Queen. He was told that he was, from that hour, a patient of the county of Surrey. He was told that a van would come at 3 that afternoon to carry him to Wandsworth. The van came. It was a plain black van with a small barred window in the door. Inside there was a wooden bench and a leather strap fixed to the wall. Ostrog was set upon the bench. The strap was passed round his waist and buckled to a ring behind him. The door was closed. The van rolled out of the yard of the gale and onto the London road. The rain fell soft upon the roof. The horses' hooves rang upon the wet stones. He could see, through the little barred window, a slow procession of hedgerows and grey fields and the low walls of small farms. He could see a boy driving a cow along the verge. He could see a woman standing at a gate with a shawl over her hair. He could see the smoke of London rising in a long grey line ahead of him against the darkening sky. The Surrey County Lunatic Asylum stood upon a rise of ground to the east of Wandsworth village. It was a great building of yellow brick, built in the reign of the late king, added to in the reign of the Queen. Its wings stretched out to either side of a central block. Its central block bore a small clock tower with a bell. Its windows were tall and narrow. Its lower windows were barred. Its grounds were bounded by a wall of yellow brick some 15 feet high. Beyond the wall were the airing yards and the kitchen gardens and the small burial ground where the poor mad were laid without stones. Above the wall rose a single tall chimney, from which a soft grey smoke drifted always into the London sky. The van halted at the gate. The gatekeeper came out in a dark coat and a peaked cap. He read the paper the driver handed him. He nodded. The gate swung open. The van rolled through into a gravelled yard. It stopped at a low door beside the central block. 2 attendants came out. They wore stiff grey aprons over dark waistcoats. Each carried a bunch of iron keys upon his belt. They unstrapped Ostrog. They led him down from the van. They took him through the low door and into a long corridor that smelled sharply of carbolic and boiled cabbage. He was taken to the reception room. He was made to sit upon a wooden bench. His clothes were taken from him and folded into a numbered basket. He was given a suit of coarse grey cloth and a pair of soft cloth slippers. His hair was cut close to the scalp with a pair of iron shears. His beard was shaved. His scalp was washed with a strong yellow soap. He was weighed upon a large brass scale. He was measured against a rule painted upon the wall. His scars were noted, as they had been noted at Aylesbury and at Chatham, upon a printed form, the old scar upon the right thumb, the long scar upon the left forearm, the thick corded scars upon the back. The medical officer, a small round man with a soft brown beard, wrote them all down. The medical officer then sat with him and asked him questions. He asked his name. Ostrog said he was Dr. Grant of Petersburg. He asked his age. Ostrog said he was 300 years old. He asked whether he heard voices. Ostrog said that his enemies whispered against him through the plaster of every wall he had slept beneath since he was a child. He said that they spoke in Russian and in Polish, and sometimes in a tongue that he did not know. He said they told him that his food was poisoned. He said they told him that the sky itself was set against him. He said he had learned, long ago, to answer them only in his own thoughts, for if he answered aloud, they would grow bolder. The medical officer wrote it all down in a large leather book. He wrote the date. He wrote the case number. He wrote, in a small, careful hand, that the patient was of foreign birth, of educated speech, of feeble frame, that he suffered from delusions of persecution, that he refused to admit the reign of the present Queen, that he was to be housed in the second gallery of the male wing, that he was to be watched at his meals, that he was not to be entrusted with a razor. Ostrog was led up a broad stone staircase to a long gallery on the first floor. The gallery ran the full length of the wing. Its floor was of polished pine. Its walls were painted a pale green to the height of a man's shoulder and whitewashed above. Its ceiling was high and vaulted. Along one side ran a row of tall windows, barred with slender iron rods. Along the other side stood a row of small wooden doors, each with a number in black paint, each with a small square opening at eye height. The gaslight hissed in wire cages set upon brackets between the doors. A single attendant walked slowly along the gallery, his keys chinking softly at his belt. Ostrog was shown into cell number 47. It held an iron bedstead, a small table, a stool, and a tin basin upon a wooden shelf. A single high window let in a square of grey afternoon light. The walls were whitewashed. The floor was of scrubbed pine. The door was closed behind him. He heard the small click of the lock. He heard the soft footsteps of the attendant fading down the gallery. He sat upon the edge of the bed. He looked at the whitewashed wall. He put his ear against it. He listened for a long time. He heard nothing. He nodded slowly to himself, as though satisfied, and lay down upon the bed and closed his eyes. That night he refused his supper. It was set before him upon the small table, a bowl of mutton broth and a piece of brown bread and a mug of weak tea. He sat upon the stool and stared at it. The attendant, watching through the small square opening in the door, saw him lean close over the bowl and sniff it, and then push it slowly away. The attendant wrote in the daybook that patient 47 had refused his food, that he had said in a low voice, in Russian, that the broth carried poison, that he had asked whether the milk had been drawn that morning from a black cow. For a black cow's milk, he said, could be trusted where a white cow's could not. The attendant did not understand the Russian. He wrote it down as best he could, in English letters, guessing at the sound. The medical officer read it in the morning. He shook his head. He wrote a note that the patient was to be offered his meals a second time each evening, in the hope that hunger might in the end overcome delusion. He wrote also that the patient's mutterings, when in Russian, were to be recorded in every particular by any attendant who might have a smattering of that tongue, for such records, the officer wrote, would in time reveal the shape of the patient's mind, as the tracks of a fox in fresh snow reveal the shape of his night's wandering. And so the long, slow work of the asylum began upon Michael Ostrog. Day followed day. The bell in the little clock tower rang the hours. The men in grey cloth were led out into the airing yards each morning after breakfast, and walked in silent circles upon the gravel for an hour, watched by attendants in dark waistcoats. They were led into the dining hall at noon, where they ate at long deal tables from tin plates, in silence, under the eye of the head attendant. They were led into the chapel on Sunday mornings, where the chaplain read the collects in a soft, level voice, and the patients sat in rows and stared, some at the altar, some at their own folded hands, some at nothing at all. Ostrog moved through it all with the careful, small tread of a man whose bones had learned the weight of many walls. He ate a little, at last, when the hunger grew too sharp. He walked in the airing yard with his hands clasped behind his back. He spoke, when he spoke, in Russian, in Polish, in French, and only rarely in the careful English he had once used to fool the country vicars of the southern shires. He watched the gate. He watched the wall. He watched the changing of the attendants at the striking of each hour. He was, in the manner of his old profession, taking the measure of the room. And beyond the yellow brick wall of the asylum, in the streets of the great grey city to the north, the year turned slowly, the winter gave way at last to a soft, cold spring, and a new season began to gather itself, silent and unseen, over the narrow lanes and gaslit corners of a small parish east of the Tower, in a district that the newspapers of London had lately begun to call, with a small worried frown, by the name of Whitechapel. Autumn of the Knife. I'll write Chapter 6 now, keeping the established voice and pacing. The winter turned at last, in the yellow brick building above Wandsworth. The frost went from the gravel of the airing yard. The green shoots pushed up between the flagstones of the kitchen garden. On the 10th day of March, in the year 1888, the medical officer wrote a short line in the great casebook of the asylum. Patient 47, he wrote, was to be discharged. The word he set beside the entry was the word the asylums used for a man they thought no longer dangerous. Relieved. The word did not mean cured. It did not mean well. It meant only that the patient could, for the moment, be turned out through the great iron gate and set upon the road, and that his bed was now needed for another. Ostrog was given his old clothes back from the numbered basket. The good black coat had been eaten at the seams by moths. The silk cravat had gone stiff and cracked. He put them on. He was given a paper of discharge and a shilling for his fare, and a small loaf of brown bread wrapped in a piece of grey paper. He walked out through the low door beside the central block. He walked across the gravel yard. The gatekeeper touched his cap to him without warmth. The great iron gate swung open. Ostrog stepped through onto the muddy road beyond the wall. He stood for a long moment. A soft wind carried the smell of the tanneries up from the river. A cart passed, drawn by a thin brown horse, laden with cabbages for Covent Garden. A gull cried once overhead. He drew his coat close. He began, slowly, to walk toward the town. He was, on that morning, a man of 55 years, though his papers had once said 40 and would soon say 60. His hair was quite grey. His beard, only lately grown back, was thin. His hands trembled a little when he lifted the shilling to his eye. He had, in his pocket, no other money. He had, in the world, no friend. He had only the small bread and the coat and the paper of discharge, and the old habits of a life he could no longer perform. He drifted, in the weeks that followed, into the lodging-houses of Southwark. He drifted along the river to Bermondsey. He drifted north across the bridges into the parishes of the east. He slept in fourpenny beds in long, low rooms where 20 men lay side by side on straw pallets, and where the air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco. He ate, when he ate, at coffee stalls by the docks, a slice of bread and a mug of hot black coffee for a halfpenny. He begged, in a low, soft voice, at the doors of the public houses. He was often turned away. He was sometimes given a copper. His name, in these months, drifted through the police books of half a dozen districts. He was seen in Whitechapel in the early summer. He was seen in Poplar. He was seen at a stall in Petticoat Lane, offering a small brass compass for a shilling. The compass had been taken from the counter of a shop in Kennington. A constable was called. Ostrog was gone before the constable arrived. His description was written into the little book at the station in Leman Street. It joined a great many other descriptions there. A thin foreign man of 50-odd years. Grey hair. A soft stoop. A scar upon the right thumb. Speaks with a Russian accent. Believed lately from Surrey County Lunatic Asylum, whereabouts now unknown. On a warm morning in July of that year, in a room high in the yellow brick building above Wandsworth, the same medical officer sat down at his desk. He opened the great case book. He turned to the entry he had written in March. He read it again. He shook his head slowly. He dipped his pen. Beside the word relieved, he wrote a small note in a careful hand. He wrote that the patient, being of a wandering habit and of unsound mind, was to be considered a lunatic at large, and that any parish officer who came upon him was to return him to the asylum at once. He blotted the note. He closed the book. He set it back upon the shelf. The book was heavy. The shelf was long. There were many other names upon it. The note beside the name of Michael Ostrog would lie there, unread, for many months to come. While the medical officer wrote his small note, the summer of that year settled upon the east of London. The parish of Whitechapel lay between the Tower and the Mile End Road. Its streets were narrow. Its houses were old. Many of them had once been the homes of Huguenot silk weavers 150 years before. Now they were let out in single rooms to families of 8 and 10 at 3 shillings a week. The lanes between them ran with the runoff from the courts. The gutters carried scraps of cabbage and fish heads. The children played barefoot in the muddy streets. The women stood in the doorways with their arms folded and watched the passing carts. The men came home from the docks at 7 in the evening with their wages in their pockets, and by 9 they were in the public houses, and by 11 they were in the streets again, singing, or fighting, or lying face down upon the cobbles, until a constable turned them onto their sides with the toe of his boot. The parish was poor. It was crowded. It was, in the language of the newspapers of the West End, a place of some concern. It held some 78,000 souls in less than half a square mile. It held 400 lodging houses of the meanest kind. It held above 1,000 women who walked the streets by night to earn the price of a bed. They walked in twos and threes. They wore old bonnets and thin shawls. They stood at the corners under the gas lamps and offered themselves for fourpence, or for the price of a glass of gin. The lodging houses would not open their doors to a woman after 2 in the morning without her fourpence in her hand, and so the women walked until they had it, or until the dawn came, or until something else came instead. On the last night of August, in that year, a woman called Mary Ann Nichols walked out of a lodging house in Thrall Street. She had no fourpence. She was 43 years old. She wore a black straw bonnet trimmed with velvet, and a brown ulster coat with 7 great brass buttons upon it, and a pair of side-sprung boots patched at the toe. She had drunk a little that evening. She had shown, at the door of the lodging-house, a new bonnet, and she had laughed and said that she would soon have her doss money, for see, she had got herself a jolly bonnet now. She stepped out into the warm night. She turned east. She was found, an hour before dawn, in a narrow gap between a school and a stable yard in Buck's Row, with her throat cut and other injuries besides. A carter on his way to work saw a dark shape upon the pavement. He thought it was a tarpaulin fallen from a wagon. He crossed the road. He saw. He ran to fetch a constable. The constable came with his bull's-eye lamp. He shone the light upon her. He said, in the low voice of a man who has seen a great many things, that this one was quite gone. The parish of Whitechapel awoke to the news at breakfast. The word passed from doorstep to doorstep. It reached the newsboys by 10. By noon the papers of London carried the story in short, careful columns. The women of the parish drew their shawls a little closer that day. The lodging-house keepers spoke of it in low tones over their counters. The men at the docks spoke of it as they carried their sacks. It was a bad thing. It was talked of for a week. And then, in the second week of September, it happened again. Annie Chapman was 47. She was small, and she was ill, and she had a soft, round face marked by drink. She had, on the last evening of her life, been turned out of a lodging-house in Dorset Street for want of her doss money. She had stood in the kitchen and said that she would soon be back, that she would get the money somehow. She stepped out into the small hours. She turned into Hanbury Street. She was found at 5:30 in the morning in the backyard of number 29, beside a set of stone steps, with her throat cut and other injuries besides. A carman going to his work saw her from the passage that led through the house to the yard. He stopped. He set down his sack. He ran into the street shouting for a constable. The papers now grew louder. The parish grew afraid. The women of Whitechapel spoke of it in the courts and on the stairs. The children stopped in their games and listened when a grown voice dropped low. The Home Secretary was asked questions in the House of Commons. The vestry of the parish sent a letter to the newspapers offering a reward of £500 for the taking of the murderer. The letter was signed by a small committee of local tradesmen. It ended in a small careful line with the words, "A man of superior education is suspected." The police read the letter. They filed it. They walked their beats a little more slowly, their lamps a little brighter, their eyes a little more careful upon the darker corners. At the end of that month, on the last night of September, the killer came again, and this time he came twice. A little after 1 in the morning, a pony trader in a yard off Berner Street drove his cart in through the gate. His pony shied. He got down. He looked. He saw a woman lying upon the wet stones close by the wall. Her name was Elizabeth Stride. She was 45. She was from Sweden. She wore a black jacket trimmed with fur, and a red rose pinned at her breast. Her throat had been cut, but the other injuries had not been done. The trader ran into the club that stood beside the yard, and the club was full of men, and the men came out with their lanterns, and the killer, it seemed, had been driven off before he had done his second work. He walked west then, into the city. 3/4 of an hour later, a constable turning into Mitre Square upon his beat shone his lamp into the far corner of the square. He saw a woman lying with her skirts flung up, and other injuries done that made the constable set his hand upon the wall to steady himself. Her name was Catherine Eddowes. She was 46. She had been let out of the Bishopsgate police station only an hour before, where she had spent the evening for being drunk in the street. She had walked out singing to herself. She had turned east. She had turned into Mitre Square. She had not walked out again. The city and the parish now stood together in a great grey silence of fear. Extra constables were drafted in from the western divisions. Men in soft shoes and civilian clothes walked the streets by night. The vigilance committees of local tradesmen kept their own watches. They walked in twos, with whistles at their necks and heavy walking sticks in their hands. The public houses closed a little earlier. The women who walked the streets kept in tighter knots. The gaslight seemed thinner in the courts. The fogs of October rolled up from the river thick and yellow, and lay in the lanes till noon, and folded the sound of a man's footstep into cotton. Through all this, Michael Ostrog was somewhere in the country. Where he was, no keeper of any door could later say. He was not upon the books of any English jail in that autumn. He was not in the wards of the Surrey County Lunatic Asylum. He was not signed into any workhouse of the London parishes in the months when the killing was at its height. He drifted, or so it was afterwards guessed, along the small roads of the shires, or in the lodging-houses of the coastal towns, or across the water in the ports of France, where the police of Paris and Rouen kept their own careful books, and wrote in them, in their own careful hands, of a thin foreign man, with grey hair and a soft stoop, who came and went from their cells upon small charges of theft. The autumn deepened. The last of the leaves fell from the plane trees along the embankment. The gas lamps were lit each afternoon a little earlier. In the parish of Whitechapel, the women grew a little bolder as the weeks passed, for perhaps, they said, the thing was done now. Perhaps he had drowned himself in the river. Perhaps he had taken ship for America. Perhaps he had been quietly locked away by his own family in some private house in the country. They spoke of these things over their gin. They laughed a little, in a small, brave way. They walked out again into the courts by night. And then, on the 9th day of November, in a small room at the back of a court off Dorset Street, a rent collector came at 11:15 in the morning to ask for the 6 weeks of arrears owed by a young Irishwoman called Mary Jane Kelly. He knocked upon her door. There was no answer. He walked round to the little window that looked into the room. A pane of glass in the window was broken. He pushed aside the coat that hung across it. He looked in. He turned away. He walked back into the court. He sat upon the low wall for a long moment. Then he walked, without hurry, to fetch his master, for he did not, he said afterwards, quite trust himself to fetch a constable. She was 25. She was the last. After her, in the parish and in the papers of that time, there were no more. The winter came in hard upon the city. The Thames iced along its banks in December. The barges lay frozen at their moorings. The gaslights burned yellow through the fogs. In a small room in a lodging-house south of the river, a thin grey man in a worn coat sat upon the edge of a straw pallet, with his hands held out to a small tin brazier of coals. He was very tired. His hands trembled. He answered, that winter, to the name of Bertrand Ashley. He had not, so far as any English constable could tell, been seen in Whitechapel in all the months of the killing. He had not, so far as any English constable could tell, been anywhere at all. The wire had gone quiet upon his name. The circulars had grown yellow in the drawers of the country stations. He was, for the moment, forgotten. But in the great red brick building on the Thames Embankment, in a room upon an upper floor, a clerk was already beginning, in that same winter, to gather together the names of all the men known to the police who had been absent from their usual haunts in the murder months. He worked by the light of a green-shaded lamp. He turned the pages of the great ledgers slowly. He wrote each name upon a small slip of paper. He set the slips of paper into a wooden tray. Near the bottom of the tray, in a small, careful hand, upon a slip like all the others, he wrote a name he had lately found in a report from the Metropolitan Police District of Wandsworth. Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor, lately of the Surrey County Lunatic Asylum, present whereabouts unknown. Chapter 6, complete. 2,522 words, ending on the clerk's ledger to set up Chapter 7's search of the records. The missing man. The clerk, who had begun the work in the winter of 1888, was a young man of 26. His name was Arthur Reeve. He had come to the yard from a solicitor's office in Chancery Lane. He had a soft voice and a careful hand. He wore a black frock coat and a stiff white collar and a pair of black cotton oversleeves to protect his cuffs from the ink. He lived in a small terrace in Islington with his mother and his younger sister, and he walked to the Embankment each morning through the fogs of the new year, his umbrella tucked under his arm, his black bowler hat set square upon his head, a hot pie from a stall on Farringdon Road, eaten quickly at the corner of the bridge. He came each morning to a small room upon the second floor of the great red brick building. The room was long and narrow. It had 2 tall windows that looked north across the river. It had a coal fire in a small iron grate. It had a long deal table set beneath the windows, and upon the table stood the great ledgers that Reeve was to search. There were 40 of them. They were bound in dark green cloth. They were heavy. Each held some 300 pages. Each page held some 20 names. The names were written in the careful copperplate of the many clerks who had come before him, some in blue ink, some in black, some in the faded brown of iron gall that had begun to eat through the paper. Reeve had been given his instructions in a quiet way, in a small office upon the upper floor, by a senior man who did not raise his voice. The senior man had said that the case of Whitechapel had left the yard with a great many loose ends. He had said that the public press was quiet upon the matter for the moment, but that the public press could not be trusted to stay quiet, and that a wise office would gather its facts against the day when the questions came again. He had asked Reeve to work through the ledgers of the prior 5 years. He had asked Reeve to draw out the names of every man known to the police of the Metropolitan District who had been absent from his usual haunts during the months of August, September, October, and November of the year just past. He had asked Reeve to make no comment upon what he found. He had asked Reeve to keep his slips of paper in a wooden tray upon his own table, and to speak of them to no one but himself. Reeve set to the work with a quiet patience. He rose each morning at 6:30. He breakfasted upon porridge and tea in the small kitchen of his mother's house. He kissed his mother upon the cheek, and he took up his umbrella, and he walked to the tram at the top of the road. He rode the tram to the corner of Fleet Street. He walked the last half-mile along the Embankment as the gulls turned over the grey river. He came into the great red brick building at 8. He climbed the stone stairs to the second floor. He hung his coat and his hat upon the hook behind the door. He set his oversleeves upon his arms. He sat down at the long deal table beneath the windows. He opened the first of the great ledgers. He began. The names came slowly at first. He had to teach himself the shape of the work. He had to learn the small notes in the margins that told him whether a man was thought reliable or dangerous, whether he had shown himself in a lodging-house lately or had passed from view. He had to learn the small stamps upon the pages, in red ink, that showed a man had been taken in for questioning, or had been sent to a country gaol, or had been discharged into the care of a workhouse, or had died. He had to learn the small crossed lines that showed a name had been struck out for good. By the 3rd week of his work, his tray held near 100 slips. Each slip bore a name in his own careful hand, and beneath the name a small line of particulars. A costermonger of Bethnal Green, known for the use of a knife in a public-house brawl, seen at his stall in July, not seen again till January. A ship's cook lately off a boat from Rotterdam, taken in for the theft of a coat in August, released upon a caution, not heard of since. A young Polish tailor of Hanbury Street, known to the constables of the district, absent from his lodgings in the murder months, said by his landlady to have gone into the country to see a sick uncle in Peterborough. Each slip was small, and each slip was quiet, and each slip lay upon the tray in its own small silence, waiting for a hand to lift it and consider it. The senior man came in from time to look. He stood at the corner of the table. He turned over the slips with the tip of a finger. He nodded slowly. He said little. He went out again. The fire in the grate settled. The coal shifted, A soft ash fell into the fender. Reeve dipped his pen and wrote another slip. He came, in the 4th week, upon the report from the Metropolitan Police District of Wandsworth. The report was written by an inspector of that district in the previous November. It concerned a lunatic who had been discharged from the Surrey County Asylum in March of that year, and who had not, in the month since, been returned to the asylum, nor traced by the parish officers of the district. The report gave the man's name as Michael Ostrog. It gave his particulars: foreign birth, Russian or Polish, height 5 feet 11, grey hair, a soft stoop, a scar upon the right thumb, age given as 40, but thought by the inspector to be considerably older, a very great liar, a man of many names, known also as Dr. Grant, as Count Sobieski, as Bertrand Ashley, as Claude Caton, as Max Grief, known to the asylums at Surrey and at Banstead, considered by the medical officer of Surrey to be a homicidal maniac when in a bad state, though quiet enough when watched. Present whereabouts unknown. Reeve read the report twice. He set it down. He drew a fresh slip toward him. He wrote the name in his careful copperplate. He wrote the particulars beneath. He set the slip in the tray. He turned back to the ledger. But the name would not leave him. He came back to the slip that evening before he went home. He drew it from the tray. He read it again. He held it a long moment beneath the green shade of the lamp. He set it back near the top of the tray, where his eye would fall upon it in the morning. In the days that followed he began, in the quiet way of the office, to hunt for the man. He wrote to the parish clerks of the districts near Wandsworth. He wrote to the keepers of the great casual wards at Lambeth and at Bermondsey. He wrote to the medical superintendents of the asylums at Colney Hatch, and at Hanwell, and at Banstead. He wrote to the port authorities at Dover, and at Folkestone, and at New Haven. He wrote, in his careful hand, upon paper of good weight, at the desks of the second-floor room, and he sealed each letter with a small dab of red wax from a stick that stood in a brass holder beside the ink-pot, and he set the letters upon a tray in the outer office to be carried down to the post at 4 each afternoon. The replies came in slowly through the raw weeks of February. Some came upon printed forms. Some came upon plain paper in the careful hands of country clerks. Some came upon foolscap in the loose hands of harried medical men. Most said the same thing. The man was not upon the books of the workhouse. The man was not upon the register of the asylum. The man had not signed the pauper roll of the parish. The man was not among the lodgers of the common houses. He was, in the language the papers themselves used, not to be found. A very few of the replies were more useful. The medical superintendent of Banstead wrote that a patient answering closely to the description had been admitted in the summer of 1887 under the name of Bertrand Ashley, and had been discharged as improved in the autumn of that same year, and had not been heard of since. The keeper of a lodging-house in Southwark wrote, upon a scrap of blue paper, that a thin foreign man of some 50 years, with grey hair and a soft stoop, had slept in his house upon several nights in the June of 1888, but had gone away, he thought, in the middle of July, and had not returned. Between these small lights, the case of Ostrog went dark. Reeve could not find him. He could not place him in the autumn months. He could not place him in the winter either. The wire had lost him. The parish clerks had lost him. The asylum keepers had lost him. He had walked out through the great iron gate at Wandsworth on a morning in March, and he had stepped, so it seemed to the young clerk in the second-floor room, into a small, quiet fog that would not lift. Reeve added a second slip of paper to the first. On the second slip he wrote in a smaller hand the particulars that had come in by post. He clipped the two slips together with a small brass pin. He placed them together at the top of the tray. He set beside them a third slip on which he wrote a single line for himself in a hand so small it could scarcely be read. He wrote, "Whereabouts during the murder months not established." He set the third slip beneath the other two. He turned back to the ledger. He worked on into March. The days lengthened a little. The fogs thinned in the mornings. The gulls quarrelled upon the parapets of the bridge. A soft yellow light fell into the second-floor room for an hour each afternoon before the sun slid behind the buildings of the South Bank. Reeve worked through the ledgers of the prior 4 years. He wrote his slips. He set them in the tray. The tray filled. He asked for a second tray. It filled also. By the end of March he had drawn out near 300 names, but among them all, only a small handful bore the same silence at the heart of the record that the name of Ostrog bore. Only a small handful of men could not be placed, in that autumn, in any bed or any yard or any dock or any van. The senior man came again on a morning in early April. He stood at the corner of the table. He turned over the slips with the tip of a finger. He read a few of them. He set them back. He asked Reeve, without heat, which of the names now seemed to him most worthy of a longer look. Reeve rose from his chair. He drew out from the tray a small bundle of 5 slips, clipped together with a brass pin. He set them upon the table. The senior man read them slowly. The first was the name of a young Polish tailor of Hanbury Street. The second was the name of a Jewish bootmaker of Berner Street. The third was the name of a discharged medical student of Blackheath. The fourth was the name of a barrister lately of the Inner Temple, known to be of a peculiar mind, who had been pulled from the Thames in the December of that year. The fifth was the name of Michael Ostrog. The senior man read the 5th slip a second time. He turned it in his hand. He looked out at the river for a long moment. He said, in a level voice, that these 5 names should now be laid aside from the greater tray, and should be kept in a smaller wooden box upon the shelf behind the desk, and that Reeve should continue, in his quiet way, to add to the box any further scraps that might come in by post upon these 5 names. He said that no other man in the office was to be told of the box. He said that the box was to bear no label upon its lid. He said that this was to be, for the moment, only a small, careful record for the private use of the chief constable. He went out again. Reeve did as he had been told. He drew down a small wooden box from the shelf. He emptied it of the pens and pencils that had lain inside. He wiped it clean with a cloth. He set the 5 bundles of slips inside. He placed the box upon the shelf behind his desk. He turned back to his work. Through the spring and the summer he added to the box. From Paris there came, in June, a short note from the prefecture, in reply to a query he had sent by way of the Foreign Office, that a man giving the name of Ashley had been held in a French prison in the autumn of 1888 upon a small charge of theft. The note was brief. It gave no dates. It gave no place. Reeve read it. He set it aside. He wrote a further letter asking for particulars. He sealed it with red wax. He set it upon the tray for the post. The reply, when it came slowly. The French clerks were busy. The wire between the 2 prefectures was thin. The particulars were slow in coming. And in the meanwhile Reeve had 5 other tasks upon his table, and his mother was ill through the summer, and he was often called home early to sit with her, and the small note from Paris slipped down under the other slips in the box, and lay there quietly, and was not read again for many months. By the autumn of 1889, 1 year after the killing, the box upon the shelf held some 50 slips. Some of the 5 men had by then dropped away. The Polish tailor had been traced to a hospital in Peterborough, where he had lain ill of the fever through the whole autumn. The Jewish bootmaker had been traced to a small workshop in Leeds, where he had passed the same months at his bench. The discharged medical student had been traced to a merchant ship bound for Australia, from which he had not returned. The barrister lay at the bottom of a churchyard near Wimborne. Only Michael Ostrog remained. His name lay in the box with a small silence around it. His whereabouts through the murder months could still not be placed. The Paris note lay somewhere beneath the other slips, its full particulars still not read, its bare surface offering only the small hint of a man in a French prison who might, or might not, have been the man in the yard's own quiet hunt. Reeve continued at his table. He grew a small brown moustache that year. He began to walk to the yard by a different route, through Lincoln's Inn Fields, for the air there was cleaner in the mornings. He was, in the small way of a careful clerk, content in his work. He did not think, as he sat at his table beneath the green-shaded lamp, that the small box upon the shelf behind him would one day be opened by a chief constable in a room 3 floors above, and that a name he had written upon a slip in his own careful copperplate in the 2nd week of February in 1889 would be lifted from that box and set down again in a memorandum tied with red silk ribbon and locked in a drawer in another quiet office, to wait for the slow hand of history to reach for it. He did not think, either, that the very same silence which had made him set the name aside, the small failure to place the man in any bed or any yard or any dock, would in time reveal itself as no true silence at all, but only as the shadow of a foreign prison the English clerks had never quite thought to look inside. He blew softly upon the ink of a fresh slip. He set the slip in the tray. Outside the window, the gulls turned above the river. A soft rain began upon the glass. He dipped his pen again, and he wrote another name. The Macnaghten Memorandum. Writing Chapter 8 now. The winter of 1893 had been a hard one in London. The fogs came down in November and did not lift until near the end of January. The river froze in patches along its edges. The gaslights burned all day in the offices of Whitehall. In the small parishes east of the Tower, the coal was dear that season, and the women stood in long, slow queues at the parish soup kitchens with their tin cans held out before them, and the children waited beside them in thin coats, silent, watching the steam that rose from the great copper vats. It was in this cold season that a small London newspaper began to print a story that would, in the end, draw a name from a shelf in an upper room at the yard and set it down in a memorandum of the chief constable. The paper was called The Sun. It was a paper of the evening, sold for a halfpenny by the newsboys on the corners of the Strand and Ludgate Hill. Its editor was a man of quick temper and quick guesses. In the middle of February, in the year 1894, he set his pages to a great new story. He wrote that the Whitechapel murderer had at last been found. He named a man. His name was Thomas Cutbush. He was a young man of some 24 years. He was, the paper said, at that moment shut in the criminal wing of the great asylum at Broadmoor. The story ran for 5 nights. Each night the paper printed fresh particulars. It gave the reader a description of the young man. It gave a small drawing of his face. It gave the story of his taking, in a small street in Kennington, in the spring of 1891, where he had stabbed a young woman in the buttock with a small knife and had run away into the fog. It gave the story of his examination by the magistrates and of his committal to Broadmoor and of the quiet way in which the papers of his case had been closed. The paper hinted at deeper things. It hinted that the young man had been out upon the streets of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888. It hinted that his family had known and had kept the secret. It hinted, in the small dark corners of its columns, that the police of the Metropolitan District had known and had turned away, for reasons that could not, the paper said, be spoken plainly. The story was read at breakfast tables across London. It was read in the coffee-houses of Cheapside. It was read in the smoking rooms of the clubs on Pall Mall. It reached in the middle of that week the desk of a man in a small office upon the upper floor of the great red brick building on the Embankment. His name was Melville Leslie Macnaghten. He was the chief constable of the Criminal Investigation Department. He read the paper through carefully. He set it aside. He rose from his chair. He walked to the window. He looked down at the mist upon the river. He stood there a long while. He was 51 years of age that winter. He was a tall man, straight of back, with a neat grey moustache. He wore, upon that morning, a suit of dark grey worsted, a stiff white collar, a pale silk necktie in a small careful knot. His father had been in the East India Company. He himself had been a tea planter in Bengal for near 20 years. He had come home to England in the autumn of 1887, upon the death of his wife's father, and he had joined the yard at the invitation of an old friend in the summer of 1889. He had missed, by 10 months, the killings of Whitechapel. He had come in when the ashes were still warm. He had read the files. He had spoken with the men who had walked the streets. He had listened, in his careful, patient way, to their guesses and their weariness. He had made, in the 4 years since, a small, quiet study of the case in the hours between his other work. He had, in that time, formed his own opinions. He did not believe Thomas Cutbush was the man. He believed the true man had been three others, or one of three others, and that the truth would never be settled between them. He believed the true man had died, or gone abroad, or been shut up long ago, in a place from which he could not come out. He believed the last of these three men most strongly, but he was a careful man, and he did not press a certainty where a certainty could not be proved. He set his three names in his mind in a private ranking, and he kept the ranking to himself. He turned back from the window. He crossed to his desk. He sat down. He drew a fresh folio of cream-coloured paper from a small stack beside the blotter. He dipped his pen. He paused a long moment. Then he began to write. He wrote in his careful copperplate. He wrote that the newspaper of the last week had raised a question of grave importance, and that a private answer to that question should, in his view, be set upon paper for the use of the office. He wrote that he could not accept, upon the evidence known to the Yard, that Thomas Cutbush was the Whitechapel murderer. He gave his reasons. He wrote that Cutbush had been a young man of a disordered mind, prone to small violences, but that the small stabbings in Kennington were, in their manner, the work of a very different hand from the work in Whitechapel. He wrote that no witness of the murder months had ever picked out the young man from a line, though many had been shown him after his taking. He wrote that the family of the young man had never, in the great uneasy silence of that autumn, been drawn to the notice of the police. He wrote that Cutbush had not, so far as the Yard could show, been absent from his home upon the nights in question. He wrote all this in a slow, level hand, without heat, without haste. He turned the page. He drew a small line beneath what he had written. He wrote a new heading. He wrote, in a careful hand, that he wished now to set down the names of the three men whom he considered, upon the evidence known to the Yard, more likely than Cutbush to have been the murderer of Whitechapel. He dipped the pen. He set down the first name. Montague John Druitt. He wrote the name in full. He gave the man's particulars beside it. A barrister of the Inner Temple. A schoolmaster at a small establishment in Blackheath. Aged 31 at the time of his death. Pulled from the Thames near Chiswick upon the last day of the year 1888. Believed by his own family, Macnaghten wrote, to have been the murderer. Believed to have taken his own life in the week after the last killing, upon the 8th of December, or thereabouts. A man of a disordered mind. A man of unusual habit. A man, Macnaghten wrote, whose absence from the world after that December had marked, if the family's belief was to be trusted, the end of the killings. He drew a small line. He set down the second name. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jew, a resident of Whitechapel, a young man of some 24 years at the time of the murders, a hairdresser by trade, committed to the asylum at Colney Hatch in the winter of 1890, upon the report of his own family that he had grown dangerous. Believed by certain officers of the Yard, Macnaghten wrote, to have been the man. A patient of a peculiar habit. A young man who would not eat food touched by another hand. A young man who was said to walk the streets by night and to speak with the voices in his head. He drew a small line. He paused. He dipped the pen. He set down the third name. Michael Ostrog. He wrote the name in his careful hand. He gave the particulars beside it. A Russian doctor and a convict, whose antecedents were of the worst possible kind. He wrote that Ostrog had been detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. He wrote that his whereabouts at the time of the murders could never be ascertained. He set down the pen. He read what he had written. He read it a second time. He had drawn the name of Ostrog from the small wooden box upon the shelf of the second-floor room. The box had been kept by the clerk Arthur Reeve for near 5 years. Reeve was no longer at the Yard. He had left the Embankment in the autumn of 1892 to take up a position in a solicitor's office in the country, near the town where his mother had gone to live after his sister's marriage. He had left the box behind him. It had been passed to a young man who came in after him, and the young man had passed it to another, and by the winter of 1893 the box lay upon the shelf of the second-floor room, with a light layer of dust upon its lid. But the slips inside had lain undisturbed. The name of Ostrog lay near the top, in Reeve's careful copperplate, upon a slip clipped with a small brass pin to two others. Beneath the three slips lay the note from Paris. The note had never been fully answered. The particulars from the French prefecture had come, at last, in the summer of 1890, but they had come in a form so brief and so cold that no clerk had known what to make of them, and the paper had been placed with the other slips, and the box had been closed again, and it had sat upon the shelf, and no man had looked into it since. Macnaghten had opened the box in the second week of February in 1894. He had opened it upon the day the newspaper first named Cutbush. He had asked for it to be brought to him in the upper room. He had turned over its slips slowly, one by one, in the light from the green-shaded lamp. He had read the name of Druitt. He had read the name of Kosminski. He had read the name of Ostrog. He had read the small note from Paris. He had folded the note. He had set the whole box aside. He had gone to his club and eaten his lunch in a slow, quiet way. He had thought upon the matter for a full week before he had put pen to paper. Now, upon this grey morning, the paper lay before him. He turned it to read it once again. He read the three names in order. He weighed them, in his mind, against each other. He did not, in his memorandum, place them in a ranking. He wrote all three as men more likely than Cutbush to have been the murderer. But in the small private room of his own thought he had, indeed, an order. He placed Druitt first, for the family's belief was a weighty thing, and the timing of the man's death was a weighty thing, and the two together made a shape that a careful officer could recognise. He placed Kosminski second, for the peculiar habit of the young man was a weighty thing, and the district in which he had lived was a weighty thing, and certain officers whose judgment he trusted had spoken of him with a slow, careful certainty that Macnaghten could not dismiss. He placed Ostrog third, for the silence around him in the autumn months was a weighty thing, but only a silence, not a witness, not a testimony, not a shape a man could point to and say, "Here, this is he." He wrote all this in careful copperplate upon 2 folios of the cream-coloured paper. He blotted the ink. He read the whole through once again. He rose from his chair. He crossed to the small fire in the grate. He held his hands out to the coals for a moment. He came back to the desk. He signed the memorandum at the bottom of the second page. He wrote the date beneath his name. 23rd of February, 1894. He set the pen down. He folded the 2 folios together. He drew a length of red silk ribbon from a small drawer in the desk. He tied the folios with the ribbon in a neat bow. He rang the small brass bell beside the ink-pot. The clerk came in at once. He was a young man of 22, new to the yard, new to the upper room. He wore his oversleeves upon his arms. Macnaghten handed him the folios. He asked that they be placed in the private files of the chief constable. He asked that they not be copied. He asked that they not be shown outside the yard. The young clerk bowed his head. He carried the folios out with both hands. He walked down the long corridor. He turned into the room of drawers. He unlocked the drawer of the chief constable's private papers. He slid the folios inside. He closed the drawer. He locked it. He wrote the date in the small ledger upon the shelf. He set the pen down. He left the room. He locked the door behind him. The gaslight in the corridor hissed on. A telephone bell rang somewhere in the building. A voice answered. Down in the yard behind, a horse stamped once and was still. In the upper room, Macnaghten rose from his desk. He drew on his overcoat. He set his hat upon his head. He walked out into the corridor. He walked down the stone stairs. He stepped out into the raw grey afternoon of the embankment. He walked west along the river. The mist lay upon the water. A string of coal barges moved slowly on the tide. The gulls turned above the parapet. He passed a knot of newspaper boys at the corner. Their voices rose and fell in the damp air. One of them held up a paper for a passing gentleman. The headline spoke of the debate in the Commons upon the Irish question. There was no mention of Cutbush upon the placards that day. The story in the Sun had faded through the week. The public had turned to other things. Macnaghten walked on toward his club. He did not look back at the great red brick building. He did not think, as he walked, that the 2 folios he had tied with the red silk ribbon would lie in the locked drawer for many years, and that a copy of them would in time slip out into the hands of a journalist, and that the 3 names he had set down in his careful copperplate would be printed in books and argued over in lecture halls for 100 years to come. He did not think, either, that the third of his 3 names, the name he had placed with the least weight of the 3, would rise in that argument to a strange kind of prominence, and that the very silence which had made him set it down, the small failure of the Yard to place the man in the autumn months, would in time be broken by a paper in a Paris archive that no English clerk had yet thought to lift into the light. He walked on toward his club. He thought, as he walked, of the soup he would take at his table by the window, and of the small glass of claret he would allow himself, and of the letters he would write that evening at his own quiet desk in the small house in Chain Walk where his wife would be waiting. Behind him, in the locked drawer of the room of drawers, the folios lay quiet in the dark. The red silk ribbon held them close. The gaslight hissed on in the corridor, and a name that had been written in careful copperplate began, from that afternoon, its slow, patient work in the memory of England. The Paris Record. The papers of a French prisoner kept, as the papers of any prisoner kept, in a great low room upon a lower floor of the building. In the case of the Prefecture of Paris, in the years of which we speak, that room lay beneath the courtyard of the great grey building on the Rue de Jerusalem, upon the small island in the middle of the Seine. The room was long. Its ceiling was low and vaulted in brick. Its floor was of scrubbed stone. Its walls were lined with shelves of dark oak, and upon the shelves stood the ledgers of the reception of prisoners, bound in calf, stamped in gold with the year of their use. A single small window at the far end of the room let in a pale grey light from the courtyard. A single gas jet burned by day and by night beside the door. An old clerk sat at a table near the door. His name was Henri Bouchard. He had come into the prefecture in the year of the Great War with the Prussians, when he was a young man of 20. He had grown grey in that lower room. He wore a suit of black cotton, and a soft black cap upon his head, and a pair of round spectacles upon his nose. He knew the ledgers as a shepherd knows his sheep. He could put his hand upon any book upon any shelf in the near dark. He could tell, from the small worn place upon the spine of a ledger, the year of its use, the season, the hand of the clerk who had first opened it. He was, in the small careful way of such men, the true keeper of the memory of the Paris police. In the summer of 1890, a small letter had come to Bouchard from a young clerk in London, upon paper of good weight, sealed with a small dab of red wax. The letter had asked, in careful French, whether a certain foreign man had been held in a French prison in the autumn of 1888, and, if so, in what prison, and upon what dates, and upon what charge. The letter had given several names: Bertrand Ashley, Dr. Grant, Count Sobieski, Claude Caton, Michael Ostrog. Bouchard had read the letter. He had set it aside. He had, at that season, been much occupied with a great matter of state, for the prefecture was then in the middle of its slow, careful inquiry into the death of a certain nobleman in a house near the Bois de Boulogne, and every hand in the office had been called to the reading of old dossiers. He had answered the English clerk, in the end, in a short note. He had written that a man giving the name of Ashley had been held in a French prison in the autumn of that year upon a small charge of theft. He had sent the note. He had thought, at the time, that he would return to the matter and set out the particulars in fuller form when the great matter of state was closed. But the great matter of state had dragged on into the winter, and then into the spring, and then into a second summer, and by the time it was closed, the small letter from London had slipped beneath a pile of other papers upon Bouchard's table, and he had forgotten it, and it had lain there, and been swept in the end into a drawer, and had gone quiet. Now, in the spring of 1895, a young Frenchman came into the lower room upon a matter of his own. His name was Jean-Baptiste Vidal. He was a journalist of 30 years, employed by a small paper of the boulevards called Le Petit Journal. He had come to the prefecture upon the letter of introduction of a friend within the office. He had asked, in his soft, careful French, whether he might sit at a small table by the window and read the old ledgers of the reception of prisoners, for he was at work upon a book upon the great criminals of the Third Empire. Bouchard had looked him over. He had asked the young man whether he could be trusted to leave the ledgers as he found them. The young man had said yes. Bouchard had nodded slowly. He had shown him to a small table by the window. He had drawn down for him the ledger of the year 1867. He had gone back to his own table by the door. Vidal worked in the lower room for many weeks. He came each morning at 10. He came out each afternoon at 4. He took his lunch at a small cafe upon the quay. He wrote his notes in a small leather-bound book. He grew known to Bouchard. They drank a small glass of red wine together at noon, upon a bench in the courtyard. They spoke, in the manner of such men, of the small doings of the office, of the weather, of the price of coal, of the young singer who was then filling the halls of the Châtelet with her clear, high voice. They did not, in those first weeks, speak of Michael Ostrog. Neither of them had, in his mind at all, the name. But one morning in the middle of April, Vidal drew down from a high shelf a ledger of the year 1888. He set it upon the table. He opened it near its middle. He was hunting for a particular case that had been much talked of in the papers of that year. He turned the pages slowly. He read the small entries in the careful copperplate of the French clerks. He came, upon a page near the end of the summer, to a small entry that made him pause. The entry was upon the 18th of July, in the year 1888. It gave the name of a man taken that day upon a small charge of theft in a bookshop upon the boulevard Saint-Germain. The name given by the man was Bertrand Ashley. The particulars given beside the name were a man of some 55 years, of foreign birth, of grey hair, of a soft stoop, with a scar upon the right thumb. The charge was small. The man had taken a volume of engravings, worth some 12 francs, from a shelf near the door of the shop, and had walked out with it hidden inside his coat. He had been taken in the street by the shopman, who had run after him. He had made no resistance. He had been brought to the prefecture. He had been held pending the report of the magistrate. The magistrate had, upon the following day, committed him to a term of 6 months in the prison of Sainte-Pélagie. Vidal read the entry twice. He was not at first sure why it caught his eye. The name of Ashley was not one he knew. The charge was small. The particulars were the plain particulars of any small thief. He was about to turn the page when he thought of something. He drew a slip of paper from his pocket. Upon the slip was written a note his friend within the office had given him some weeks before. His friend had told him that the English police, some years ago, had asked after a man of many names who had passed through the prefecture in the autumn of the murder year. His friend had thought the story might one day make a small piece for a paper. His friend had written upon the slip, in a hasty hand, the names the English had given. Vidal drew the slip from his pocket. He unfolded it. He read the names. Bertrand Ashley, Dr. Grant, Count Sobieski, Claude Caton, Michael Ostrog. He set the slip down beside the ledger. He looked from the one to the other. He drew a slow breath. He turned the pages of the ledger forward. He wanted to see how long the man had been held. The entries of the following days made no further mention of Ashley. He turned back to the entry of the 18th. He read the small note in the margin. The note said that the prisoner had been transferred, upon the 20th of July, to the prison of Sainte-Pélagie, to serve his sentence. He rose from his table. He crossed the room. He asked Bouchard for the ledger of the reception of prisoners of Sainte-Pélagie for the same year. Bouchard looked at him over his round spectacles. He said, in a slow, patient voice, that the ledgers of Sainte-Pélagie were not kept in this room, for that prison had its own registers, and that its registers had been sent, upon the closing of the prison in 1899, to the General Archive of the Prefecture in a warehouse upon the Quai de Valmy. Vidal thought a moment. He said that he would go to the warehouse the following day. Bouchard nodded. He returned to his own work. Vidal went to the warehouse upon the Quai de Valmy upon the following morning. It was a low grey building beside the canal. It smelled of damp paper and mice. An old man in a blue apron let him in and led him along a narrow corridor to a small room at the back. In the small room stood a great many wooden crates stacked to the ceiling. Each crate bore a label. The old man read the labels one by one. He found the crate that held the ledgers of Sainte-Pélagie for the years 1887 to 1890. He pried open its lid with a small iron bar. He drew out the ledgers. He set them upon a plain deal table. He went out again. Vidal sat at the deal table. He opened the ledger of 1888. He turned the pages to the 20th of July. He found the entry. Bertrand Ashley, transferred from the prefecture upon that day, committed to a term of 6 months, to be served in the 3rd gallery of the eastern wing. He turned the pages forward. He read the small monthly notes upon the conduct of the prisoner. He read the note of August. He read the note of September. He read the note of October. He read the note of November. He read the note of December. He read them a second time. He set the ledger down. He looked out at the grey water of the canal beyond the small window. The notes were plain. They were the plain notes of any small prisoner. Ashley had worked in the shoemaker's shop. Ashley had been quiet. Ashley had been given a small punishment upon the 10th of September for the theft of a piece of leather from the bench of another prisoner. Ashley had been given no other punishment. Ashley had been discharged, upon the completion of his sentence, upon the 20th of January in 1889. He had been in Sainte-Pélagie from the 20th of July 1888 to the 20th of January 1889. He had been in the prison, without break, without escape, without absence, through every one of the 6 months that held within them the whole of the autumn of the killings in Whitechapel. He had been in a cell in the 3rd gallery of the eastern wing on the last night of August, when Mary Ann Nichols had died in Buck's Row. He had been at his bench in the shoemaker's shop on the morning of the 8th of September, when Annie Chapman had been found in the yard of Hanbury Street. He had been asleep in his cell on the last night of September, when Elizabeth Stride had fallen in Berner Street and Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. He had been at his supper in the long common hall of the eastern wing on the 9th of November, when Mary Jane Kelly had been found in the small room off Dorset Street. Vidal wrote it all in his small leather book. He wrote the dates of the killings in one column. He wrote the notes of Sainte-Pélagie in another. He drew a small line between them. He wrote a single line at the foot of the page in a hasty hand. Impossible, he wrote. He underlined the word twice. He carried the small leather book back through the streets of Paris that afternoon. He walked slowly. He was, as young men of his trade are, already thinking of the shape of a story. He was thinking of how it might be told, and to whom, and in what paper, and with what small, careful weight of proof. He was thinking, too, of the great weight of the thing itself. A name that had lain for near 7 years in a memorandum in a locked drawer at Scotland Yard, a name that had been set down as one of the 3 most probable authors of the worst crimes of the age, was, in truth, the name of a man who had been shut in a cell in a Paris prison through the whole of the terrible months. The English had not known. The French had not thought to tell them. The prefecture had answered a small letter in a small note, and the small note had gone quiet upon a table in London, and the man had lived on, in the great memory of England, as a shadow of a killer he had never been. He came at last to the little office of his paper upon the Boulevard des Italiens. He climbed the stairs to the room of the editor. He set his small leather book upon the desk. He said, in a soft voice, that he had a small thing to lay before the paper. The editor was a busy man. He was reading a long telegram from Rome. He waved a hand without looking up. He said that he would come to it in the afternoon. Vidal set the book upon the corner of the desk. He went out again into the street. He walked to a small cafe upon the corner. He sat down at a table on the pavement. He ordered a small glass of wine. He watched the carriages passing in the boulevard. He watched the ladies walking beneath the plane trees. He watched the small yellow lamps beginning to burn in the windows of the shops as the light drew down. Far away, across the grey water, in the great red brick building on the embankment, the folios that Macnaghten had tied with red silk ribbon lay in their locked drawer. The name of Ostrog lay quiet within them. The clerks of the yard walked in the corridors above, unknowing. The gaslight hissed on. A telephone bell rang. A voice answered. A horse stamped once in the yard below, and was still. And the small paper truth that had lain for near 7 years in a warehouse upon the Quai de Valmy began, at last, its slow, patient journey toward the light. The forgotten name. The years that followed the discovery in the warehouse upon the Quai de Valmy passed slowly over the name of Michael Ostrog. The small story that Jean-Baptiste Vidal had carried up the stairs of his paper upon the Boulevard des Italiens was, in the end, not printed in the form he had wished. The editor read the notes upon a Friday afternoon. He nodded. He said it was a curious thing. He said it might make a small piece for the Sunday paper, in the corner of the 4th page, beside the theatre notices. He said that the English would not care to see it, and that the French readers would not know the English names, and that the whole matter was, after all, 7 years old and cold. He wrote a small paragraph himself, in a hasty hand, and set it into the paper for the following week. The paragraph gave the bare facts. A man named Ashley, known also as Ostrog, had been in a French prison through the autumn of the Whitechapel murders. The English police had once thought him a suspect. They had been in error. The paragraph was printed. It was read by a small number of Parisians over their morning coffee. It was folded away. It was forgotten. The paper crossed the channel in the mailbag of the Foreign Office. It was clipped by a young man at the yard whose duty it was to gather notices of English matters from the papers of the continent. He set the clipping upon a tray with a great many others. The tray was carried, in due course, to the second-floor room where the ledgers were kept. The clipping was pinned to a small note. The note was placed in the box that had once been Reeves'. The box was set back upon the shelf. No man of any rank at the yard was told of it. Melville Macnaghten did not see it. He had, by that year, moved to the office of the Assistant Commissioner upon the upper floor, and the small boxes upon the shelves of the second-floor room were no longer within his daily walk. The clipping lay in the box. The dust settled upon the lid. The name of Ostrog, in the small, quiet way of such names, drew a further veil about itself, and grew a little dimmer in the memory of the yard. Ostrog himself was, in those same years, drifting through the last country of the poor. He had been discharged from a small term at Wormwood Scrubs in the autumn of 1894. He had been taken again in the winter of 1896 for the theft of a book from a stall in Farringdon Road. He had been given 3 months. He had come out thinner. He had been taken again in the summer of 1898 for the theft of a microscope from a shop in the Strand. He had been given a term of 5 years, for the courts had grown weary of him, and the small book of his previous convictions had grown thick with the entries of many hands. He served the term at Parkhurst upon the Isle of Wight. He was released, an old man, in the winter of 1904. He was 71 years of age, if his papers could be trusted at all, though his true age no man could ever say. He walked out of the gate of Parkhurst upon a raw January morning. The sea wind came up the road from the Solent. It carried the smell of salt and coal smoke. He wore his old black coat, grown quite thin. He wore a pair of boots given him by the chaplain of the prison, for his own had fallen at last to pieces. He carried a small paper of discharge and a shilling for his fare. He walked to the little station at Newport. He took the train to Ryde. He took the ferry to Portsmouth. He took the train from Portsmouth to Waterloo. He came into London upon the evening of the same day. He stood upon the platform under the great iron roof. Steam rose about him. Porters hurried past with their barrows. He held his small paper in his hand. He looked, for a long moment, like a man who has forgotten why he has come. He drifted, that last year, from one casual ward to another. He slept in the ward at Lambeth. He slept in the ward at Southwark. He slept in the ward at St. George's in the east. He was known to the porters. They gave him a bed at the end of the row, near the door, where the draught came in beneath. He picked oakum in the mornings for his supper. His fingers were stiff with the cold. The tar of the rope came away in small black flakes and stained the whitewash of the walls where he leaned his hand. He ate his bread slowly. He drank his tea from a tin mug held in both hands. He spoke little. He answered, when spoken to, in a soft accented voice. He gave at the door of each ward a different name. Bertrand Ashley at Lambeth, Dr. Grant at Southwark, Michael Ostrog at St. George's. The porters wrote down whatever name he gave. They did not check it against the books. In the spring of 1904 he came into the infirmary of the workhouse of St. Giles in the parish of Holborn. He came upon a Monday morning. He was thin. His breath rattled in his chest. His hands trembled. The porter at the gate looked him over. He asked his name. Ostrog gave it, that morning, as Michael Ostrog, of no fixed address. The porter wrote it in the great book of the reception. He set the date beside it. The 10th of April. He set the age beside it. 71 years, so the man said. He set the trade beside it. None. He rang a small bell. A nurse in a grey dress and a white cap came from the infirmary. She led Ostrog across the yard. She led him up the stone stairs to a long ward upon the first floor. The ward was long. It held 20 beds, 10 upon each side. The walls were whitewashed. The floor was of scrubbed pine. A row of tall windows looked out over the yard. A single coal fire burned in a small grate at the far end. The beds were of iron, painted white. Each held a straw mattress, a coarse grey blanket, a pillow of feather ticking. Above each bed was a small wooden shelf. Upon the shelf sat a tin mug, a tin plate, a wooden spoon. The men in the beds were old. Most of them lay very still. Some read, in the pale grey light, from small tracts given them by the chaplain. Some slept. Some watched the ceiling with the small patient eye of men who have grown used to waiting. Ostrog was set in the bed nearest the door. His clothes were taken from him and folded into a numbered bundle. He was washed with a yellow soap and dressed in a nightshirt of coarse cotton. He was helped into the bed. He lay back upon the pillow. He looked up at the whitewashed ceiling. He closed his eyes. He was, at last, quiet. The medical officer of the workhouse came to him in the afternoon. He was a young man with a soft round face and a small brown moustache. He listened to the old man's chest with a wooden tube. He held the old man's wrist between his fingers. He looked into the old man's eyes. He wrote a short note upon the printed form at the foot of the bed. He wrote that the patient suffered from a wasting of the lungs, that his heart was weak, that his frame was much reduced by long privation. He wrote that comfort should be given. He did not write of a cure. He knew there was none. Ostrog lay in the bed for many days. The nurses brought him a bowl of broth at noon. They brought him a mug of milk at 4. They brought him a small piece of bread and butter at 7. He ate a little. He drank a little. He slept a great deal. When he was awake, he watched the light move slowly across the ceiling. He watched the shadow of the window bars fall upon the whitewashed wall and creep, hour by hour, from one side of the ward to the other. He listened to the sounds of the workhouse in the yard below, the tramp of the paupers coming in from the labour yard, the clang of the great copper vats in the kitchen, the soft voice of a nurse calling to a child in the next ward, the bell of the little chapel ringing the hours. He spoke, in his last weeks, in a low voice, sometimes in Russian, sometimes in Polish, sometimes in the careful English he had once used to fool the country vicars. He spoke of the birch forests of his youth. He spoke of the great stone stove in the house where he had been a child. He spoke of the taste of salted cucumbers pulled from a wooden barrel. He spoke of the sound of a priest chanting in a small wooden church. He spoke of a woman who had sung him to sleep when he was very small, though he could not, he said, remember her face. The nurse who sat beside him wrote none of it down. She was a young woman from Kent. She did not know Russian. She did not know Polish. She held his hand a little when he grew frightened. She wiped his brow with a small square of linen. She was, in her small careful way, kind. He died upon a Sunday morning in the middle of May, in the year 1904. The bell of the little chapel of the workhouse had just rung for the 8 o'clock service. A soft rain fell upon the roofs of Holborn. The light in the ward was grey. The nurse was at the far end, changing the sheets of another bed. She heard a small sound from the bed by the door. She came at once. He was lying quite still. His eyes were open. His hand lay open upon the blanket. She closed his eyes with her fingertips. She folded his hands upon his breast. She drew the sheet slowly up over his face. The medical officer came within the hour. He wrote in the book that the patient in bed number 1 had died at 8 of the morning of a wasting of the lungs and a general failure of the heart. He wrote the name in the book. Michael Ostrog. He wrote the age. 71. He wrote the birthplace. Russia. Beside the birthplace he wrote, in a small, careful hand, the words supposed. He blotted the ink. He closed the book. The body was carried down to the small, dead house at the back of the workhouse. It was washed. It was dressed in a plain shroud of unbleached calico. It was set in a coffin of thin pine, unpainted, without a plate. Upon the following morning the coffin was carried in a plain cart to the parish burying ground upon the Harrow Road. It was set into a common grave with 3 others. A young curate read the burial service from a small black book, standing at the head of the grave in a soft rain. There were no mourners. The gravediggers stood a little apart with their spades in their hands. The curate closed the book. He turned and walked away across the wet grass. The gravediggers filled in the grave. They set no stone. They set only a small wooden peg with a number burned into it, that the sexton might find the place again if he were ever called upon. The name of Michael Ostrog was written that morning in the register of the burials of the parish of St. Giles. It was written in the plain hand of a country clerk. It was written between the name of a stonemason and the name of a washerwoman. It was written without ceremony. It was written without note. It was the last time in his life that his name would be set down in any book of any office of any English place. Below it, upon the same page, there was a small blank space where the trade of the deceased was usually given. The clerk had not known what to write there. He had left it empty. At the yard, upon the embankment, the news of his death did not come. The porters of the workhouse did not think to send word. The clerks of the parish did not think to send word. The name of Ostrog had passed, some years before, from the daily lists of the men to be watched. It had passed from the circulars sent out to the country stations. It had passed from the small books of the beat constables. It lay only in the great box upon the shelf of the second-floor room, and in the folios tied with red silk ribbon in the locked drawer of the chief constable's private files, and in these 2 places it lay quiet, and it grew a little dimmer with each passing year. The years went on. Melville Macnaghten retired from the yard in 1913. He wrote a small book of his memories. In the book he set down the story of the Whitechapel case in a careful, guarded way. He named no man. He gave no particulars. He spoke only of 3 suspects whom he had, in his day, thought more likely than the man in Broadmoor. He died in 1921. His memorandum lay on in the locked drawer. Some years later, a copy of it, made by his own hand for his daughters, slipped into the hands of a writer who published its contents at last. The 3 names came, in that season, into the great, slow argument of the historians. Druitt, Kosminski, Ostrog. They were printed in books. They were argued over in lecture halls. They were set upon lists, and taken from lists, and set upon them again. The name of Ostrog rose and fell, in the tide of that argument, like a piece of driftwood upon a grey sea. Some writers made a strong case for him. Some made a strong case against. In time the paper from the warehouse upon the Quai de Valmy was found, and the truth of his 6 months at Sainte-Pélagie was known, and his name was drawn quietly, at last, from the small list of the possible. He lies now in the common ground of the Harrow Road. The wooden peg has long since rotted. The grave is unmarked. The rain falls upon it in the winter. The grass grows over it in the summer. The birds of the parish rise from it at evening and turn once above the low grey wall and are gone into the London sky. And so we leave him, in the quiet ground of a city that did not know his true name, that could not have said, upon the morning of his burial, whether he was born in Warsaw or in Kiev or in Riga, whether his father was a priest or a soldier or a merchant, whether the small scar upon his right thumb had come from a knife in a Frankfurt alley, or from a chisel in a workshop in the Petersburg of his boyhood. We leave him among the many nameless of that century, in a grave that holds three others, beneath a soft rain, beneath a soft grey sky. The candles have burned low. The chamber is silent. The great ledgers stand upon their shelves. The folios lie in their locked drawer. The red silk ribbon has grown a little faded with the passing years, and history once again turns the page in the dark.